So you have your agenda here next to you for those of you in the room. For those online, we'll begin with now with our welcome and opening remarks. And then we will move into a presentation by Professor Antonella Muraro for a food allergy update. Then we will look at how COVID is impacting the future from Dr. Doug Jones. Next, Dr. Marcus Maurer will provide how to improve the management of patients with chronic urticaria. We'll wrap up the day with updates from GINA and GOLD, the global guidelines in asthma, as well as COPD, from Dr. Ensham Arora and Dr. Daniel Ray. So again, this is going to be a full scientific update of many of the therapeutic areas that we cover. Unfortunately, our atopic dermatitis speaker came down with COVID and was unable to submit the update in atopic dermatitis, but has promised us that she will do that and share it with us after the meeting. So that was Dr. Luz von Aschier. But nonetheless, so you can see kind of the way we'll spend the balance of our time, and really look forward to the time together. We did decide to do all of the sessions, the educational sessions, pre-recorded, just to make things a little more seamless with in the room and online. But I have had conversations with each of the presenters, and I will try to address any specific questions. If there is something I can't address, then I will send those back to them and they will respond and we'll follow up. So we will have Q&A time after each presentation. And with that, I think we're ready to go. So our first speaker is Professor Antonella Muraro, who is the head of the Veneto Region Referral Center for Food Allergy Diagnosis and Treatment from Padua General University Hospital in Italy. Professor Muraro is such a dear friend of GAAPP. She is the past president of the European Allergy, Asthma Society and Conference that we're here in Prague today. And Professor Muraro is here on site, and so if you happen to run into her throughout the conference, please give her your regards and best for joining us and for providing this 2022 food allergy update.
I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me in providing you with an update in food allergy, and I would focus my presentation on the guidelines for food allergy management provided by GINA, which is the Global Allergy and Asthma Network of Centers of Excellence, in each chapter devoted to anaphylaxis and food allergy. I am Antonella Muraro, leading the Food Allergy Referral Center, the Padua University Hospital in Padua, Italy. These are my disclosure. I have been PI for Immune DVB Technologies at Novartis and served as a speaker for several companies. The food allergy guidelines were launched at the joint meeting of World Allergy Organization and British Allergy Society in Edinburgh, Scotland, April 22, and are currently after revision further to the submission to the World Allergy Organization journal. And I am speaking on behalf of the guidelines group. My co-chairs are Susanne Alken, Graham Roberts, Margita Worm. Graham Roberts has coordinated the full project with methodologist Deborah De Silva. And I guess that you are familiar with all these colleagues. But why we needed a new guidelines for clinical practice in food allergy? We are now facing a changing landscape for the field of food allergy, and I will illustrate this a bit and then provide an outline of the framework of the guidelines along with the recommendation for food allergy immunotherapy and practical implication, which patient to select, where to perform, and how that means selecting the right patient, the right product. I will give clues on recommendation for biological therapy, ending it up with a summary and ultimate goal. Food allergy is a burden, not only for the size of the problem, as we know that the prevalence is increasing not only in westernized countries, but also across the globe, but as many factors, such as the speed of response, a few minutes up to 2 hours, the dose and type of allergen, the age, can trigger a severe reaction that can be worsened by the lack of access to prompt treatment by the presence of comorbidities such as asthma, atopic dermatitis, cofactors such as exercise, by history of severe reaction. Most of the reaction we know well occur outside home, and here we have a lack of knowledge in the community on how to properly managing this patient, especially for inadequate food labeling, and this has provoked death and undermined constantly and daily understanding the risk for the severe reaction, influencing the burden for the patient with huge impact on quality of life. On the other side, however, we have now an increasing awareness on the need of adequate intervention, and new legislation are put in place, such as in UK and Ireland. We know well that increasing threshold doses could reduce the risk of an allergic reaction after accidental exposure to peanut, for example. We appraise better the need of continuous education and psychological support for this patient, and we have new therapeutic options available in the market and many under evaluation. This has prompted a lot of expectation regarding immunotherapy from our patient and their need to have sound recommendations. The aim of these guidelines is to summarize evidence about the effectiveness of approaches for dietary management, immunotherapy, use of biologicals in children and adults. This evidence has been translated in good clinical practice guidelines in the recommendations intended to optimize patient care. These recommendations are informed by a systematic review of the evidence and contain an assessment of the benefit of harms. This means that they can be used for public health policies, as they are not only a matter of efficacy. These guidelines have been prepared under the principles of generation of high quality guidelines, ensuring that all stakeholders and opinions are represented, that the transparency of any potential conflict of interest is provided, a transparent systemic appraisal of the evidence, identifying any bias, such as using grade, has been put in place, and drafting of guidelines with recommendation has been performed, combining a systematic review, other evidence, and expert opinion. We have included the gaps and identified gaps of knowledge, benefit and harms, values and preferences, as well as resource implications. The first version of the guidelines manuscript has been published in GAAPP website for 2 weeks, January, February 22, as a public review. In overall, 54 authors and 21 expert reviewers joined their efforts in this guideline project, with the huge stakeholders involvement, including clinicians, psychologists, epidemiologists, dietitians, food scientists, methodologists from across the globe, and as well as patient organization representatives, 7 from Europe, US, Canada, Australia, and the public comments from industry represented were taken. Key clinical questions were addressed in the guidelines: dietary intervention effectiveness for people for food allergy, role of educational intervention and effectiveness, efficacy, safety, and cost effectiveness of allergen immunotherapy alone or combined with a biological for people with any age-limited food allergy, efficacy, safety, and cost effectiveness of biological therapy used alone, and the best way of identifying people at risk of severe reaction and how should risk can influence the management of food allergy. I would focus on allergen immunotherapy with the systematic review and meta-analysis addressing, as said before, key questions: efficacy, safety, and cost effectiveness of immunotherapy alone, immunotherapy with biologicals alone, and then the efficacy, safety, and the cost effectiveness of different routes of immunotherapy for children, adults with any IgE-mediated food allergy. And this has been published in Allergy 22, beginning of this year. In this infographic, we can have at a glance evaluation of the outcomes of the systematic review, where we included 39 trials for a total 2,244 patients with food allergy, mainly children. Looking at the allergen immunotherapy, in green, we have an evaluation of probably good safety and effectiveness, which is good for all immunotherapy for milk, peanut, and egg, epicutaneous immunotherapy for peanut. On the other side, we have a known safety and effectiveness of sublingual immunotherapy for above food and subcutaneous immunotherapy. Specifically, for oral immunotherapy for peanut, as a number to treat of 2, to increase tolerance to single dose of 300 milligram up to 1,000 milligram proteins. We have several sections in food allergy guidelines, as well as recommendation for dietary intervention, for including elimination diet, formula for special needs, allergen immunotherapy, indication, contraindication, setting and approach, biological therapy, educating individuals and family, identifying and managing risk. We have included a consideration for implementation of these guidelines, resource implication, specifically audit criteria, research gaps, and all consideration in online supplements. What I would like to provide you with is the glossary that is understanding exactly what our recommendations were performed and how they were worded. We delivered the recommendation when at least 80% consensus among the group members was achieved. And we spoke about the strong recommendation for using the wording recommends when we are confident that the benefits outweigh the harms. In practice, this means that most people in this situation should be offered the intervention and would likely want it. In policy, the recommendation can be adopted in most situations. When we have stated the condition recommendation form, we used the word suggest. This means that probably the benefits outweigh the harms, but we are not fully confident of the size of the effect may differ in some people. In practice, this means that different choices will be appropriate for different people. Clinicians could help each person make a decision consistent with their preference. And policies may differ depending on context that should be developed with the involvement of a wide range of stakeholders. And we provided tables with the evidence of effectiveness was combined with benefit versus harms, patient caregiver values, feasibility, and costs. What about recommendations for peanut immunotherapy oral route? The GAAPP Task Force recommends offering peanut oral immunotherapy under special supervision with standardized evidence-based protocols using food products or licensed pharmaceutical products where appropriate to selected children from 4 years of age with clinical diagnosed severe IgE-mediated peanut allergy to increase the amount of peanut tolerated while on therapy. This is a strong recommendation in favor of peanut oral immunotherapy, given the uncertainty about the evidence regarding desensitization. The number needed to treat to achieve one person tolerating 300 or 1,000 milligrams of peanut protein while in therapy was 2. And the certainty of evidence refers to how confident we are that available evidence represents the true effect of intervention. For epicutaneous immunotherapy, the task force suggests offering peanut immunotherapy and specialist supervision using licensed pharmaceutical products if they become available, to select the children aged 4-11 years with a clinical and diagnosed IgE-mediated peanut allergy. The standard recommendation is positive, but not the strongest possible because of moderate certainty in evidence, likely variations in individual preferences, potential burden, and cost of treatment as a product is not yet in the market. For oral immunotherapy, for cow's milk and egg immunotherapy, the task force suggests offering hens, egg, or cow's milk immunotherapy for patients suffering from hens, egg, or cow's milk allergy to increase the amount of allergens tolerated while on therapy. The strength of recommendation is positive, but not as strong as possible because moderate certainty in the evidence, likely variation in individual preference, potential burden and cost of treatment as we don't have any licensed product. Practical implications considered the patient, which patient should be included in this process, in this procedure. Patient with an history of IgE-mediated systemic allergic reaction after ingestion of positive oral food challenge, especially when allergy may be transient. That means that we should have evidence of allergic sensitization, skip test, in vitro specific IgE test positive for primary food allergy as opposed to polyfood allergy syndrome due to cross-reactivity. We should consider persistent food allergy with low likelihood of spontaneous resolution, patient with previous severe reaction to the food or impaired quality of life due to the burden of food allergy. But we have also to include the motivation that affected people and their caregivers should be motivated, adherent, and capable of administering emergency treatment, including intramuscular adrenaline in the case of adverse effect, and that affected people and caregivers should have a full understanding of effectiveness, side effects, logistic, and potentially lifelong duration of the therapy with the willingness to incorporate the food into the diet. Appropriate staffing, environment, and approach should be put in place. Personnel trained and experienced in the use of immunotherapy for food allergy, including medical doctors and nurses with competence in diagnosing and managing food allergy, should be the appropriate staff. Provision to provide appropriate intervention and observation dependent on the severity of any allergic reaction, emergency equipment, and a medication to manage medical emergencies, including severe anaphylaxis and rapid access intensive care if needed. How can we select the right patient? We should consider adherence, the need to avoid unnecessary treatment, and the age of our patient. For the adherence, clinicians should discuss potential benefits and harms to evaluate adherence if they are capable to manage side effects. Some people may prefer to avoid offending allergen. Instead, careful selection is needed to avoid unnecessary treatment, as many children outgrow and cause milk allergies by school age. And with regard to age, we make recommendation for allergy immunotherapy from 4 years of age based on the effectiveness evidence, the potential to outgrow the food allergy, logistics, and potential harms. In spite of the fact that the recent randomized clinical trial on the efficacy and safety of peanut oral immunotherapy for induction of sustained responsiveness in children below 4 years of age has been recently published in Lancet. So we need to provide a very tailored and personalized treatment in a shared decision-making process. And with regard to selection of the right product, standardized evidence-based product with a protocol and licensed pharmaceutical product where available should be preferred. Only standardized protocols with evidence of effectiveness and safety should be used under specialist supervision. If products are used, care should be taken that doses are appropriate and consistent in terms of their allergen content, biological potency, and lack of contaminants. Given this consideration, clinicians and patients may prefer to use licensed medicinal products prepared under good manufacturing practices for pharmaceutical products. On the other side, we should always consider affordability, quality of an alternative, risk-benefit, patient preference, and local context should also be taken into consideration. For biological therapy, they have the potential to target multiple different food allergies and coexisting allergic diseases. However, we were not able to provide any recommendation for or against offering atopic for treating food allergy and for offering omalizumab for treating food allergy, alone or in combination with immunotherapy. And the reason is that there is insufficient evidence in systematic review, and the set of evidence was very low. One randomized controlled trial of omalizumab and another of atopic found trends toward higher threshold for reaction in adults with peanut allergy, but the studies were small, heterogeneous, and too few to draw conclusions. So there are some promising early data from non-controlled studies, but they were out of the scope of the review, systematic review, and we need confirmatory evidence from large, adequately powered trials before biological can be recommended for general use in food allergy. Omalizumab is a special case as it is already an established treatment for severe allergic asthma, so may be preferred biological for patients with food allergy and asthma. Clinicians should also consider testing the therapy in selected people, such as those with recurrent episodes of anaphylaxis in spite of allergen avoidance. This overall is a huge research gap, and we should perform an analysis of existing observational data together with new research trials. In summary, the guidelines is targeting healthcare professionals, supporting clinicians and adults with food allergy. The recommendation were developed by taking evidence from 161 studies and experts from 18 countries. And as far as recommendations are concerned, strong recommendation in green and orange, less strong recommendation are here illustrated. Avoiding triggering allergies is a less strong recommendation based on the lack of randomized clinical trials for all patients and all food allergens. We suggest a hypoallergenic, extensively hydrolyzed amino acid-based formula for infants needed breast milk substitutes. We suggest to avoid partially hydrolyzed cow's milk and mammalian milks, and for age less than 6 months, soy formula based. We recommend to provide oral immunotherapy for peanut in children from 4 years of age with severe peanut allergy, and we suggest oral immunotherapy for all food allergies, including egg and cow's milk in the same children. Epicutaneous immunotherapy for age of 4 in children with severe peanut allergy is suggested when the licensed product, when it will become available. The ultimate goal is to deliver the right treatment to the right patient and maximize the quality of life. And this can be done through harmonizing best practice in creation of vertical and horizontal network among centers of excellence and primary care. This ultimately will lead to change in public health policies for the provision of the most appropriate treatment to each patient and for preventing inequalities. I would like to thank you all on behalf of my colleagues and to invite you to the Galen Anaphylaxis and Food Allergy Forum that will be held next September 1-3 in Padua, Italy. And this is the link for registrations, which is free of charge. I thank you all and I wish you a very nice webinar.
Such a wonderful job giving that update on food allergy. Really appreciate her knowledge and expertise as the lead author on the Galen guidelines. So I'll open it up. Any thoughts or questions for those of you who cover food allergy, who that is in your remit of your mission? Any specific thoughts or questions that you have based off of that discussion?
I mean, not really a question, but more like a remark. In Serbia or in Bosnia, I'm sorry, we don't have even a possibility for OIT. You know, there is no such a possibility. The nearest possibility is in Croatia, in Zagreb, where one doctor is conducting. Yes, but it's another country, it's another state, and for many patients, it's not from patients from region. They don't even know about that possibility, or when they do know, it's representing for them a big, great cost. And of course, I mean, the main, at least for me as a parent of 2 children with food allergies, is that uncertainty is like, am I going to really go through this and give my child food that he's allergic to with possibility for a better quality of life or not? So actually, maybe it's not a question regarding specifically this representation, but maybe for you as a mother whose children went through it, how not how to make this decision, but what signs should we look in making that decision?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, I think it's a very individual decision. I think that every family has to weigh the risk and benefits, the willingness to accept certain or tolerate certain risk, knowing that if you do go the route of oral immunotherapy or any type of treatment, that the likelihood is you're going to have reaction. I mean, that is the point of OIT, is to elicit reaction to ultimately desensitize the person to the child to that food. I'm hopeful. What we've seen and what I think that the Galen guidelines certainly represent here is that there's progress, right? So we had 0 treatments in the last guidelines. Now we have 3 with somewhat to strong recommendation in peanut, and a couple, one in hen's milk, and I mean one in hen's egg and one in cow's milk. So I think that the science is evolving. The challenge is that I sit on this as the mother of a food allergic child who is 17 and did not have the options necessarily in that window of 4 to 11. Now having conversations with her as at the time that these things were in trial and available, she never wanted to participate. She never wanted to explore that. She said, I'm good with avoiding. I haven't had an anaphylactic reaction in years. Like, I don't want to go through that. I'm okay just avoiding peanut and tree nut in her case. And so I think that as a parent, you have to take into consideration your own risk tolerance, your child's risk tolerance, what the long-term gain is, and also how it interrupts the rest of your life. I think that as you were sharing, to think about traveling to a different country, the expense, the time, the inconvenience, like all those things have to be weighed. And that's why I love the Stacey Jones article in Lancet of this year, which really does highlight that shared decision making, because it's not your choices, may not be my choice, may not be your choice. And we have to learn to get to a place where we respect that in our community there's going to be a lot of different options and decisions. And we're all navigating the best we can as parents of food allergic children. So having that mutual respect for whatever the choice may be is something that I think we could all learn from and do a better job of. Yeah.
Sure. I know on the one slide she was talking about the different stakeholders that were consulted when creating the guidelines. Were families included in this?
Yes. So again, this is the first time in the food allergy guidelines that we did have patient and caregiver family involvement to the degree that we had this time. And so I had the opportunity to review and be a part of that process, and have actually been working now on some shared decision-making tools that are based on these guidelines. So it is very exciting. I think there were 7 patient reviewers in that particular update of the guidelines. And this is something that I was just actually having a conversation with the professional societies of both EAACI and ERS in the last few weeks, the need to have greater patient involvement in clinical guidelines, and making sure that we bring into the context of that patient perspective, and that it not just be based solely on the peer-reviewed literature, because if so, you're missing a great deal of the insight and nuance to managing these chronic conditions. So I'm pleased to say that we're seeing that even in urticaria, we've got great patient engagement in the guidelines and clinical practice parameters. So it's changing, but it's been very slow. For those of us who've been around in this space a long time, it's a welcome change for sure. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? This is scary having 2 Tonyas in the room. I have to tell you, it's a little odd. But no, again, any questions coming from our online audience? Can you see anything coming from that group?
We have one question. There was one question from Gabriela Cromoy from Argentina. She's asking about what the recommendations for managing OIT in latex food syndrome are.
Yes. So latex, we have certain foods that cross-react with latex. And so things like banana, avocado, actually the body recognizes those proteins like latex allergy. And so there are specific guidelines for latex allergic individuals in addressing avoidance of certain foods. And we can follow up and get that information to you. It's not reflected in this Galen 2. That's not a topic that was widely addressed. It focused more on peanut, milk, and egg. But I certainly can follow up with that resource on those foods to avoid. It's really interesting how for some individuals, their bodies recognize those foods as having the latex protein. So thank you for that question. And for those of us who are here in the room, if you will, when you get the opportunity to ask a question or speak, just say kind of who you are, where you're from. I think that's a great practice. Thank you, Suzanne, for doing so with our online questions as well. That way we'll get to know everyone online and in the room. Other thoughts or questions? You know, for me, this really comes down to the summary for the food allergy update and the guidelines for me is that we're making progress, right? As I said before, 5 years ago, we didn't have any treatments in food allergy. Now, at least we have one licensed, approved product for peanut, more coming. The data is evolving on the biologic front, although it was not at a level of recommendation for the 2022 review. I think there's more data coming in that regard regarding omalizumab and etoposide. So Unfortunately, for millions living with food allergies across the globe, it's still avoidance primarily. That's still going to be that primary approach to managing food allergy. But there's hope. And again, we're seeing greater involvement in the patient voice moving forward. And it's thanks to individuals like Professor Muraro, who has really been the champion of that. And look forward to getting this update in years to come with more solutions for families. All right, we can move on. So our next presentation is from Dr. Douglas Jones. He is the co-founder of the Global Food Therapy, Food Allergy Support Team, and OIT Connect, and also the director at Rocky Mountain Allergy and Tanner Clinic in Layton, Utah in the United States. Dr. Jones is going to speak to us today specifically about how COVID impacts the future. But what I will say before we begin his talk is this reminds me, we are hosting the Global Food Allergy Summit alongside Dr. Jones and the Global Food Therapy Group, October 1st and 2nd. So mark your calendars for that. Definitely if you have interest in food allergy and the science, the future treatments, you'll want to participate in the Global Food Allergy Summit on October 1st and 2nd. But now let's turn our focus to COVID and how it continues to impact the future.
Hi everyone, it's great to be with you, and my presentation today is going to be on how COVID impacts the future. So there's going to be a couple of objectives. First of all, we'll take a look at the current state of COVID-19, but then we'll move quickly into some thoughts on the long haul. So what's the current state of COVID-19? Well, this is a good snapshot. This is referenced from the website of Johns Hopkins University, where we take a look at just a snapshot globally of what's happening with COVID. And this is data as of the 22nd of June, 2022. What we've seen, total cases reported is over 500 million. And number of deaths is over 6 million. But then when we look at total vaccine doses given, that's over 11 billion, 11.5 billion. That's a staggering number. And if you look over at the right side on these graphs, we have the weekly cases from 2020 all the way through until current. We have the weekly death rates, and then we also have weekly doses administered of the vaccine. Now, you kind of see there was some, in terms of weekly cases, some peaks and valleys all along 2020, 2021. But then at the beginning of the end of 21, beginning of 22, we saw Omicron, and we saw this big spike up there, and then it's kind of gradually dwindled. What's really interesting in this case, though, is we did see a little spike in the death rate with Omicron, but the death rate wasn't near as high as previous when we were kind of still in the beginning parts of the pandemic. So we're continuing to obviously see some variants. We're seeing those things, but overall, cases have now begun to trend down again, but we're also continuing to have great vaccine rates. Now, in the news, what we're going to continue to see from now and probably moving forward in years to come, we're going to continue to hear talks about variants, the vaccines. You know, much of the world has had the primary vaccine doses, but a lot of the world hasn't. And so I think we need to, get some rationing out to where most of the world, if not all of the world, has an opportunity to have at least that primary vaccine series. We'll then hear, in the news, ongoing boosters and how many boosters to get and how frequent boosters to get. But then probably the biggest emerging topic is one called long haulers. It goes by various names. You may hear the term long COVID, long haulers COVID, or post-acute COVID syndrome. And I'll get into in just a bit what this means in more detail. But first, what are some thoughts then on the long haul? If we look at COVID-19, I'm going to walk you through just some basics. So we had the emergency of this novel coronavirus 19 towards the end of 2019 and into 2020. At that point, we were faced with mandates and lockdowns and a whole lot of fear and unknowns. Well, as we kind of transitioned over the last couple of years, we realized COVID-19 is here to stay. It's not going to just go away. And so we then had to transition from kind of the newness and the novelness of it to how are we going to manage this moving forward, especially with all the variants coming out. There's this constance of misinformation. There's kind of debates from a political standpoint where, politics gets involved and often may even overshadow health decisions. And people sometimes when it comes to vaccine or not vaccine, they're making political decisions more than health decisions. And so that, I think, is going to continue to happen as we move forward. We'll also see a continued play on our fear, our doubts, and division. So how do we make informed decisions? How do we live with this? How do we manage this moving forward so that we don't have to have this constant fear and doubt and worry? I've got a couple of suggestions that I will dive into in a little more detail. What I'm going to suggest is put mindfulness over your emotion, first of all, and let's also put solid education over bias. Let's be prepared, not scared. So mindful, how could we manage mindfulness over emotion? First of all, we have to realize and be mindful that none of us are immune to targeting ads. Be mindful or be aware of things that you're going to see in the media. What are you going to see in the media? Clickbait, headlines. They're going to try and put correlation. Well, I'm telling you, correlation does not equal causation or science. It's something that we observe, it's something to be looked for, but it doesn't equal causation or science. We see a lot of clickbait in headlines on anecdotes. We hear the worst case scenarios, whether it be for COVID or vaccines or reactions. All the worst case scenarios, clickbait anecdotes are going to be out there. Sometimes those things happen, and I don't mean it to disregard any anecdotes or even be insensitive to any anecdotes, but sometimes what may happen with one person doesn't necessarily translate into the population. And so while anecdotes can be compelling, again, they're not going to necessarily equal science. And social media certainly doesn't equal science. Why? Because division drives dollars. And so social media clicks or clickbait, that equals money. So they're driven to create controversy. They're driven to spike our emotions and fuel our emotions so that we get that emotional irrationality and get people charged, because that's where the debate comes in, the divisions come in, and that just drives their dollars. And whether you know it or not, you're being targeted, I'm being targeted, we're all being targeted. The question not necessarily is, whether we're targeted or not, because we will be. The question is going to be, are we mindful of it? Are we aware of it? And how do we handle that? Do we allow ourselves to continually be emotionally charged and disregard science? Or are we going to be mindful that perhaps we are being targeted, and how do we, develop a defense against that? Education. Education is probably the greatest tool that we may have to arm ourselves as a defense to, towards not being emotionally charged, but being mindful. One of the things that I like to talk about is, can you prove the other side right? So many times we get locked into our own belief, and we're so locked into that belief that we defend it so much that that's all we listen to, that's all we take into account, and we start cherry picking all kinds of data or headlines. Be willing to be wrong and change and evolve. That's what science does. Science is a beautiful thing because it auto-corrects. As we go along, we may have a certain hypothesis, we do some good solid methodology, and we'll either prove or disprove, but as we go along, science will auto-correct. It's willing to evolve and be willing to evolve and change. But we have to look at it as a whole, and so I'm saying don't just cherry pick your side alone, and don't get emotional of it, and ask yourself, am I the product here being used? Rather, seek to gain an understanding. Gain a better understanding of pitfalls and traps with science and even statistics, because those same people that are targeting you will try and say, this is science. They'll try and say, these are the statistics. but they're also very smart in trying to manipulate what may appear to be science or what may appear to be statistics. So we also have to realize that sometimes things get wrapped in the coating of research or science, but when we look beyond the headline, when we look beyond the title, we may often see that's not science at all, or that's not research at all. So don't get fooled by just that headline. Look deeper into it. Some questions you can ask is, who's funding the research? What limitations are there? Are they really showing what they are claiming to show? Be cautious of absolutes and extremes. Those are things that we can do to just use some critical thinking and gain some better understanding. Go to some trusted resources that don't have certain agendas so we can enhance our education. So how do we apply this to COVID-19? Let's start with just looking at what is COVID-19? What is the coronavirus? Here's a graphic of what the coronavirus looks like. You can see there's a couple of parts to the virus. There's kind of the outer part that looks like a crown, which is why it's called coronavirus. That's called an S protein, and that S protein is made of two segments. There's an S1 and an S2. So that's that outer portion that kind of surrounds the rest of the virus, and inside that is where RNA is encased in a globe. And so you have the RNA, not DNA, that's inside, and then you have these spike proteins, which are the outside. And the transmission is mainly by droplets. Well, what does all this mean? I want you to think of the coronavirus, I want you to think of these S proteins right here as like a key that you're going to put into the lock of your house. So we have the key, which are the S proteins, that can fit into the lock of your house. And what's the lock of your house? The lock of your house is going to be called an ACE2 receptor. So you can look at that over here. So if our body is the house, the S protein, that S1 protein on the coronavirus is the key. The lock that separates that is something called an ACE2 receptor. So how does the coronavirus gain access into our body? Well, just like an intruder that may be coming in from the outside, you can imagine an intruder approaching your door. Well, there's various ways that they could get into your house. One of the easiest ways, even if your house is locked, is for them to have a key to your door. So they can take that key, insert it into the lock, open the door, and gain entry. That's kind of what happens with the coronavirus. That S protein is that intruders coming in. That S protein can bind in with that ACE2 receptor and open the lock and gain entry into our body. Now, so right here, you can kind of see that lock-in key mechanism. You see this little blue portion down here, that's the lock. And then this coronavirus, you can see that S protein hanging off the end, that's the key. So that coronavirus here is approaching our body, if you will. This key attaches to this lock, and it allows that virus to gain entry into our body, or that intruder to gain entry into our house. Well, it gets even trickier than that. So you may think, well, what are some other defense mechanisms that my body may be able to come up with, or our house? So on your house, you may have a security system. You may have cameras installed, or you may have sensors on your windows, or something on the outside that alerts you to an intruder coming towards your house even before they have an opportunity to put the key in the lock and open it up. So you have an even quicker frontline defense than that lock on your door. You may have, like I said, those security cameras or sensors. Well, the coronavirus is kind of smart because it has things that can disable those frontline defenses. Basically, it can, like, if it's an intruder coming to your house, it can disable your security cameras. It can disable those sensors on your windows so that you don't detect it. It can disable that before getting there. Now in our body, those frontline defenses, those security cameras or those sensors are called interferons. Not that you have to memorize that term, I just want you to hear it. Those interferons act as a frontline defense. Well, COVID-19 is really sneaky, and it can disable those interferons. It's got several proteins on the coronavirus that can disable that. So what can happen is when that frontline defense is disabled, coronavirus can then come in, put the key in the lock, and open the door and gain entry into our body undetected, and it can start replicating undetected for a period of time without us even knowing. While it's replicating, it's creating some destruction, but it's also driving inflammation. And that's a major part of the coronavirus. You often may have heard the term cytokine storm. That was kind of a popular term that was getting a lot of social media clickbaits. Well, where does that cytokine storm come from? It's basically inflammation that's being driven by the coronavirus. And that's happening because it disabled our security cameras, the frontline defenses. It put the key in the lock, gained entry, and was replicating and doing destruction before our body could really detect what was happening. So all of that was occurring. Well, at some point within our house, if we had a sensor tripped or maybe somebody heard, maybe a next door neighbor heard the intruder coming in, it can then set into other protective mechanisms. And just like that, maybe we tripped a sensor, but it's going to take some time for the police to come and capture the intruder. Well, just like that with our immunity, it's taking our body a little time to catch up with that coronavirus. And so eventually our immunity can catch up and help, in a majority of the cases, get the intruder neutralized. So we want to talk about what are some things that may put our house or our body at risk. Some things that can facilitate that intruder getting in is if you have a house, for instance, are your windows broken? Do you have a hole in the door? Do you have a leaky roof? What's happening is, are things broken? Well, just like within our body, things that may put us at risk, do we have like a heart disease, diabetes, old age, lung disease, different things that can put us at risk of that intruder creating more damage. Well, this slide, I understand, is a very busy slide, and it's not intended for you to really understand a whole lot of it, but what I wanted to demonstrate with this slide was there are multiple drivers of inflammation from coronavirus. So when this virus gets into our body and it creates that destruction and inflammation, it's not just one thing. It's not just one little pathway that this is occurring by. It's multiple pathways, and it's a cascade of events that can occur. And it happens a spectrum of disease. We see a spectrum of how it affects different people. Not only do we all have different houses and maybe quality of products that house is made of, meaning our overall health, but how it affects us once it gets in can be different. And so it can affect different parts of the body, sometimes the lungs, sometimes the heart, the kidneys, the nerves, the gut. And some people may have all of the above that it's affecting. Well, part of the reason for that is not only are each of our bodies different, but also how our body responds, and we have multiple drivers of inflammation. That's really the only point that I wanted to bring up on this slide is the complexity of this. It's not just simple in one little thing. But again, COVID-19 has that key, but the baseline house is not necessarily the same for us. Even despite that, what we see is, so we see these multiple inflammatory pathways coupled with different health baselines. We can see this spectrum of disease. Even with all of this, we have a survival rate of 98 to 99%. That's helpful. But what can happen, though, is not only are we seeing disease acutely, but we may also see something chronically. So even amongst the 98, 99% of people that are surviving, there is a certain percentage, I've seen anywhere from 10 to 40 to 50%, maybe on average 25 to 30%, that are still having some chronic ongoing symptoms. And we call this long haulers. So let's differentiate COVID-19 versus this concept of long haulers. What's the difference? COVID-19 is going to be an acute infection. So it's acute, we have an infection, that's the initial entry into the body, and we have an immune response along with the destruction and the inflammation that I talked about. Again, we have a 98 to 99% survival rate on that, but chronically, even once that infection is neutralized and cleared, some people may have some ongoing health issues. What are those ongoing health issues due to? It's due to inflammation and destruction. And there's about 10 to 50%, again, on average, maybe 25, 30% of people that have this long haulers or this chronic inflammation and destruction. So they have all these symptoms that are ongoing even after the virus has passed. So with COVID, we want to think about a number of things. We have this long haul COVID where it's multi-system and it can extend for many months. What can happen is when part of the destruction that can occur is when COVID is putting the key in the lock, it can actually destroy that lock. And once that lock is gone, we're even more vulnerable to some ongoing problems. Another thing that I want to touch on is how COVID can disrupt, as it comes into our body, our microbiome. What's a microbiome? It's kind of that balance of bacteria within our body and on the outside of our body that maintain certain health and defenses. Well, when COVID comes in, it can disrupt that. And there's kind of this balance between inflammatory bacteria and anti-inflammatory bacteria. With COVID, the more inflammatory bacteria are left, and those patients, baseline, that are already have kind of this imbalance of bacteria, they're 3.5 more times to be put on a ventilator and 9 times more likely to die. So this biome that we have within our body and outside of our body is really an important thing to consider, just baseline, but COVID also can disrupt that. And then we can have multi-organ effects. As we've talked about, we could have an autoimmune response. Many, if not all of our body systems can be affected. And we can see something, especially in children, something called multi-system inflammatory syndrome, where different parts of their body can become inflamed. And this can lead to some of these post-COVID conditions. This is an important consideration because a lot of times people will say, well, children respond overall, pretty well to the virus. Survival rates are high. Should we vaccinate them or not? It's a great question and something that we definitely need to think about, but there are children that can be at risk for some of these post-COVID conditions where they're inflamed, and vaccination may prevent some of that. And so that's something to just take into consideration. When we talk about long-haul COVID, we've got new or ongoing symptoms, and it runs the gamut. This isn't even an all-inclusive list that we look at. People will have difficulty breathing, tiredness, fatigue. When people have acute COVID, they may lose their sense of smell, but as time goes on, their smell may come back, but it may be distorted. The loss of smell is called anosmia, but when it's coming back, there's another term that we call parosmia, where it's distorted. So what I mean by distorted is something that may have smelled nice originally, now almost could smell rancid or foul. It can make it very difficult to eat. Instead of, a lot of people, if they're trying to maybe smell a nice cup of coffee in the morning, instead of it being that nice smell to them, it becomes a rancid smell, or, a particular kind of food dish that they enjoyed smelling. Instead of that, now it's foul, and so it makes it very difficult to eat because it's disgusting. That's a major problem. People can have chest pains and heart palpitations. They may feel pins and needles. They may have dizziness, mood changes. All kinds of things may happen in this with ongoing symptoms after COVID has resolved. Other effects, in particular, the mental effects. Now, even if we don't have perhaps mental effects from long haulers, there was a lot of people just going through this process where they felt a lot of anxiety, depression. Why? Fear of the unknown. nervous or scared that this microscopic thing could potentially threaten their life or their family members. There was a lot of negative economic situations because of all of the lockdowns and mandates that were put into place. So many, businesses went under, people losing their jobs. There was so much negative economic impact that also plays on the mental and emotional well-being. Also, one thing that perhaps I don't think was talked about enough was a lack of access to healthcare or routine care delayed. When there was so many lockdowns and mandates, people were postponing or delaying just routine care. So perhaps routine cancer screenings were delayed and maybe cancers weren't detected early like they would have been under normal conditions. And so there was kind of this lack of care, with so many people indoors and inside, activity levels dropped, sleeping patterns disrupted, and all of this kind of circles together. So there were so many effects related to this that I think we need to be mindful of. So how do we respond to this? What I say, moving forward, let's act, not react. Let's optimize our immunity, and when we do that, maybe we can optimize our life. How strong is your house? So one thing that we can do, as I mentioned before using the house analogy, if we have different health conditions that aren't managed or aren't cared for, maybe we have an uncontrolled diabetes. If we have an uncontrolled diabetes, for instance, or an uncontrolled lung disorder baseline, and then we have the threat of the intruder to our house, well, that's going to do more destruction and damage. So what can we do? We could optimize our diabetes management or optimize our lung disorder by following, doctor's orders and having good management. So we want to strengthen our house. Basically, if you have a leaky roof, let's try and fix that roof. If you have a broken window, try and fix the window. Or do some things with the upkeep of your house to maintain good quality on that. How strong is that? Those are things that can help us in our immune defense. One of the things that we can start with right away, diet. What are we putting into our bodies? What kind of building blocks is our house made of? Are we putting good quality fuel or building blocks into our bodies so that we can and then create our immune system? Or are we putting junk in there? Is our house made of good, sturdy quality? Or is it made of warped wood or cracked brick or whatever? What are the building blocks that our house is made of? Take some personal accountability for your own health. An ounce of prevention can be worth a pound of cure. During the pandemic, how often did you hear any government talk about a proactive immune prevention when it comes to your immunity? How many times did you hear that? It was everything, not everything, but most of the things that I heard from the headlines and the media and social media was all about reaction. What medicine can we try? What vaccine is coming down the pipeline? Not that those aren't important. Treatment is important. Acute treatment's important. Vaccines are important because vaccines help promote our immunity. They build our defenses. But we didn't hear much about what can we do ourselves, right? We didn't hear much about what can you do with your diet? What can you do with your activity level? What can you do with your mental health, your emotional health? All of those things kind of play a role. How can we optimize our immunity? I've got several recommendations that we can do moving forward so that we can best prepare ourselves to handle whatever variant comes down the path or whatever the next pandemic may be. Concentrate on your diet, more vegetables, whole foods, improve our gut health. Start with something small, realistic. What about your sleep or rest? I think this is one aspect that's most ignored in a lot of people. And I want you to think about, what are you doing the 1 hour before you go to bed? Are you locked into devices? Or are you shutting those things down? Or are you powering down? Think about what's happening 1 hour before you go to sleep. What about your other health issues? Are you ignoring diabetes? Are you ignoring your high blood pressure? Are you ignoring your perhaps weight gain or something? We want to take control of those things. Another thing as important is vitamin D. Vitamin D plays a critical role in our immune system and inflammation. Get a vitamin D level checked. What's your activity level? no matter what that is, even if you have some health conditions that prevent vigorous exercise, start with something. Just think of what you can do. When we think about all of these things, how can we reduce stress? Take some positive steps, whether it's a couple minutes of meditation, silence, prayer, deep breathing, whatever the case is, whatever works for you, think about how can we reduce some stress. On all of this, what I just said may seem quite overwhelming. It's like, how do I attack every single one of these? That's a lot to do. All I'm going to ask is think through this and find one simple thing that you can do realistically in your life to make a better change for that day. We can also prime our immunities. What if we had a playbook, what if you're like a sports team, what if you had the opposing team's playbook? For instance, what if you knew what plays they were going to run, how you could defend that? What if you, on your house, if we get back to that analogy, and you had a security system, what if you had a police patrolling your neighborhood ahead of time, so even if the intruder can disarm your frontline defenses and has a key to your lock, what if you had a policeman that was roaming around your neighborhood? Even if they're there, they would be able to jump that ahead of time. That's kind of like what a vaccine can do. It can prime our immunity, and it can put like a neighborhood watch out there or a police out there patrolling for the intruders even before they have a chance to disarm our frontline defenses. So it's a way to really enhance and optimize our immunity. If you knew your intruder was coming and you knew how they were going to get in, you could defend that a lot better. So vaccines are important, and they can give us, that playbook, but it is just part of the solution. The message has been so many times, it's the only solution. But what I would say is, it's part of the solution, but take accountability for yourself in all of those things that we talked about before with your own health. I understand some of the hesitancy with some people with vaccines, and they're not perfect. They do have some side effects, and we have to be mindful of those, and we can manage that. But we'll be aware, but overall, the benefits are going to far outweigh the risks in most cases and most situations. So take these into consideration of how we may be able to optimize our immunity, optimize our life. If any of the suggestions that I talked about in terms of how to take that accountability for your own life on kind of a holistic approach, if any of that seemed overwhelming and you want kind of a playbook on how to, realistically go about this to make some positive change in your life, connect with me. You're welcome to follow me on Instagram. You can message me there. There's my handle there. I can help you with a playbook and help you get on a plan to where you can realistically address, from a holistic perspective, your life and your well-being, and kind of help coach you on optimizing your immunity in your life. So I appreciate this time. Hope this was helpful in giving you a perspective on COVID, giving you an understanding of what the virus is, but also kind of moving forward some of those health problems that a lot of people are dealing with all over the world now with post-infection problems. So I wish you all the best and good health. Thank you.
I love the way he breaks this down so simply, right? An analogy that we can all relate to, that we can apply as we think about how we continue to deal with COVID. I don't think there's probably a family in the room that hasn't been directly impacted by the pandemic, and I'm sure you've got loved ones that are battling with these long COVID symptoms. I know I do, and so really thought it was a great. Any questions, comments? How about online? Do we have anything first? No? Okay. And we'll ask here in the room. Anything? An interesting thought that Doug didn't get into the depth of is that actually he is running a telehealth program now where you can have different diagnostics, because we know there are different phenotypes even of long COVID. And there are different treatments that are working with different patients. So depending on if you're having mainly the brain symptoms or if you're having mainly the heart symptoms post the acute infection, there are different approaches, treatment approaches. So, I think we're learning and the science is evolving really rapidly here. But what we do know, without a doubt, is that long COVID is T-cell immune dysregulation. So for those of us who are in immunology and respiratory, it's here to stay. It is going to be part of our world and our remit of our patient community that we serve. Kristen?
My name is Kristen Willard. I work for the COPD Foundation, and this is probably one of the best presentations I've ever seen explaining COVID. I think probably many of your organizations, after some time, we saw some fatigue with COVID education, where people were like, I don't want to hear any more about it. The fact that it's here to stay, just as you're saying, I think that we'll see an interest in being educated, a resurgence in it, I guess to say. Are there any plans to make any of these available? Because that was just, it was really excellent.
Yeah, thank you.
Very clear.
Asking. Yeah, so actually, Dr. Jones and I are working on a Netflix special about this. And in the US, we'll be launching it on Netflix and then hopefully translating it and putting it out all across the world. So I agree with you. I heard him do this back in early May for the first time. And I said, first of all, I have to bring you to this forum and to share globally. But secondly, we have to find a way to get this out in a more organized fashion. So we got some funding and we're going to make a Netflix documentary.
Do you know when it's coming?
By the end of the year. So yeah. Thanks for reinforcing that we did the right thing there, because I think it is. I agree with you. I'm tired of COVID. Trust me, I am so ready to move on, and I am probably the one of at Allergy and Asthma Network. March 17th, 2020, we decided to host our first COVID webinar. And I had no idea what it was. I had no idea what we were, but we had one expert, Dr. Purvi Parikh, and she did that webinar. We now have done 38 webinars, over 2 million viewers to the webinars, and over 2 million, 2.5, almost 3 million people coming to the COVID-19 Information Center in that same time frame. And so, yes, we're tired of it. Yes, we want to move on. But we have to find ways to make it relevant to our community and find ways, I think, also to hedge our defenses. And I think that's what Doug did such a beautiful job of talking about, like, what can I do? The importance of vitamin D, the importance of the holistic approach, and optimizing our immunity, because it is here to stay. And so I think changing our mindset is half the battle of that too. I thought, 18 months max, we'll be out of this, 18 months. And here we are 30 minutes later. So it is really unbelievable. But I think that I definitely had a period where I was having trouble making that mindset change. And it was when I finally accepted, no, this is the new normal, right? We're never going back. That I think I got it, and I realized, okay, I can do this. So yeah, great. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, then we will move right into our next presentation. Just by way of reminder to those in the room, we do have food in the next room. At any time you need to take a break, feel free to do so. We don't have formal breaks because of the online forum. And the toilets are out in the foyer there and to the left. So if you need the restrooms, please feel free to do so. Our next presentation comes from Dr. Marcus Muraro. Dr. Muraro really needs no introduction when it comes to the chronic urticaria space. He is the guru, but he is the professor of dermatological allergology at the Clinic of Dermatology, Venerology and Allergology of the Charité University Medicine in Berlin, Germany. He's going to share with us how to improve the management of patients with chronic urticaria, and he also leads the UCARE program.
Ni hao, hello, and welcome to chronic urticaria and how to improve the management of patients. My name is Markus Maurer. I'm joining you from the Urticaria Center of Reference and Excellence here in Berlin, and I'm very happy to share with you tips and tricks for how to better manage patients with chronic urticaria. These are my conflicts of interest, and I want to start out by making it very clear that chronic urticaria has a high need to treat. Not treating is not an option. It is a debilitating disease, often uncontrolled. Most patients have wheals and many patients have angioedema. And in patients who have both wheals and angioedema, things are even worse than in patients with wheals alone and angioedema alone. Let's also not forget, many patients have more than one form of chronic urticaria. Of course, chronic spontaneous urticaria is the most common one, but the other ones are not rare. Many of them occur together with chronic spontaneous urticaria, making things worse. What does it do to have chronic urticaria? Well, all aspects of life are affected by this disease. Work, fun, there are comorbidities and consequences that further impact on the burden that comes with this disease. We also need to remember that this is not something that patients have for a couple of weeks or months. No, this is something that patients have for many years. And when we look at how well things are going today in the real world, most patients do not have their disease under control. You can see here 79 stands for 79% of patients with uncontrolled chronic urticaria as measured by the UCT, the Urticaria Control Test. This will become very important later on. So let me show you that the Urticaria Control Test, no matter how long patients have the disease, 1 year, more than 1 year, more than 2 years, more than 8 years, will reflect poorly controlled disease today in most patients who have this disease. So it's a good thing to think about. What can we do better to bring more control to patients? Because it is very clear to me that we don't have the perfect solution for everyone, but with the solutions, with the treatments, with the diagnostics that we have today, we can do much better than helping only 1/3 of patients or less. The guideline is an important instrument because it, guides us on how to perform the diagnostic workup and how to do the treatment. Let's start with the diagnosis. And in the most recent version of the guideline, we talk about the 7 C's. Now, what are the 7 C's? Here they are. We have to confirm that it is the right diagnosis, make sure that we look for underlying causes to get a better idea about what to expect from treatment, but beyond that, assess comorbidities and consequences, cofactors and components, and maybe most importantly, measure disease activity, impact, and control. How does that all work? It's a 2-step procedure. The basic setup is to do only very few things. We look for inflammation, we look at the differential blood count. New in the guideline, we look for IgE and IgG anti-TPO, and that's it. Beyond that, the history taking is the most important asset that we have in our diagnostic workup. When we ask the right questions and get answers that move forward our diagnostic approach, yes, then we should do further testing. If there are no answers that guide us to further insights, then we don't need to do further testing. Rather focus on the treatment. Now, I talked about this basic setup, and it really refers to all the 7 C's. What we must do in everyone, though, is to measure disease activity, impact, and control. How do we do that? We have 6 tools. 2 for the disease activity, that's the Urticaria activity score and the angioedema activity score. 2 for quality of life, the burden, the impact, the Chronic Urticaria quality of life questionnaire, CU-QOL, and the I-QOL, the angioedema quality of life questionnaire. And maybe most importantly, the 2 control tests, the Urticaria control test and, for patients with predominant or only angioedema, the angioedema control test. In the guideline, a lot of focus is on the Urticaria control test, and this is why I want to remind you, patients need to have at least 12 of 16 points to have well-controlled disease. That's the minimum, so to speak. But when we are really happy is when our patients are really happy, and that is when they have complete response, complete control, 16 points. This test is so easy, quick, and straightforward to perform and also to evaluate. No patient should be treated without the use of the UCT. And here in Germany, just last week, we launched CRUISE, the Chronic Urticaria self-evaluation app, which brings the UCT in an electronic form to all patients to help them achieve control and maintain control. This is really all I wanted to say about the 7 C's. Please do read the entire guideline. It will provide further information. Make sure that you don't look only at causes. In fact, make sure that you look at all aspects of the disease to get a good understanding of where patients stand. And then let's treat these patients. How should we treat patients with chronic urticaria? Well, this version of the guideline, and that's not different from previous ones, says, treat the disease until it is gone. What does that mean? It means complete control, no more signs and symptoms, and a normal life. These things we can measure, and this is why we should measure them to make sure that we know where patients stand and where we want to get them, and that we get them where we want them to be. Now, the new guideline also provides a path, of course. It doesn't just say, treat the disease until it is gone. It also tells us how to treat. And you will see that this guideline version only has 3 steps. Step number 1 is an antihistamine. Pick your favorite one. Use it at standard dose, not longer than 2-3 weeks. Whatever doesn't happen then doesn't happen later on, which means we should increase the dose where we can, up to 4 times the standard dose. Again, no use in doing this for years or switching to another antihistamine or combining with steroids. No. If the antihistamine does not provide complete control in our patient, then we should move to omalizumab. And when standard omalizumab, 300 milligrams, every 4 weeks, does not work, in other words, does not make our patient a complete responder, the guideline says use more and use it more often, or do both. Updose to 600 milligrams, give it not every 4 weeks, but every 2 weeks until you have achieved complete response. And where this doesn't happen, patients should be moved to cyclosporin. Now, how does this work? We talked about the UCT, the Urticaria Control Test, and basically you can have 3 different options of outcome of the UCT. Number 1, the disease is poorly controlled, less than 12 points in the UCT. This means only one thing, and that is we have to step up. We have to do better than what we're doing at this point. If this is a standard dose antihistamine, no control, step up, increase the dose. If the patient is already receiving higher than standard dose antihistamine, step up, go to omalizumab, and so on. Now, the second outcome could be patients showing us well-controlled disease, 12, 13, 14, 15 points. And what that means is time to optimize, time to work with what we have and bring it to outcome number 3, complete control. We are only happy when patients have a UCT of 16, and when they do, and they have it for a long enough time, then we can think about stepping down. The only reason to step down, and this should only be done in complete responders, is to check if patients have experienced spontaneous remission. So don't do this too often, and only do it in complete responders. I want to give you some examples. Omalizumab, the second-line treatment option, it works very well. This is placebo, and here you have the true outcome. And you can see how fast it works across all patients, how well it works as long as the drug is in the patient. But you can also see the signs and symptoms come back when the drug is stopped. So this means that we should treat the disease until it is gone by using omalizumab long enough for spontaneous remission to occur and in a high enough dose so that it does the job. The best dose to start patients, and this comes from a beautiful meta-analysis done by Cao Zitao and his team, the best dose to start is 300 milligrams. That does not mean that going up in the dose doesn't help those patients who do not respond to 300 milligrams. It does. Please also use it in patients with angioedema. It works really well in angioedema. And when you have achieved control, and you decide to stop omalizumab treatment and the signs and symptoms come back, then don't wait like we did in this study until patients have the full effect of the disease again. No, this is not needed. The signs and symptoms will come back and they will be as strong as they were before you started omalizumab treatment. So treat again, retreat, it will work, but do it as soon as you see that the disease is still there. One last thing. Can we expect the same outcome of omalizumab in all patients? No. We know that there are at least 2 reasons for patients to have chronic spontaneous urticaria. It can be autoimmune on the left or autoallergic. And patients with both of these subtypes can experience complete control. But when you have a patient with autoimmune chronic spontaneous urticaria, you have to be ready for patients to have patience. They need longer. And this means we should encourage patients with markers of autoimmune chronic spontaneous urticaria to treat longer, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months before we give up. They can still respond after 5 months of not happening anything. Can we predict response based on IgE? Well, yes. I'm always happy when my patients have high IgE because I know that high IgE is linked to complete response. But that does not mean that all patients with low IgE will not respond. Everyone gets it, and we are ready for this to take longer in patients with autoimmune chronic spontaneous urticaria. Optimize? Well, of course. Complete response means stay with it. No response means we have to do better. And partial response means let's optimize. Let's use the drug more often and or at a higher dose. My last 5 minutes will be on where does the future bring us in terms of getting better at treating chronic urticaria. And today, we know of many drivers of this disease. Of course, most of them linked to mast cells, but also basophils, eosinophils, T cells, and B cells. And everything that's blue on this slide is a target of current treatment development. Look, we can go against mast cell activators such as IgE. We can go against mast cell mediators. But there's also two very new ways of treating chronic urticaria, and I want to share them with you. Inhibitors of mast cell mediators. The oldest story in the book, 70 years of antihistamines getting better. But is antihistamine the only mediator we're working on? No. There are clinical trials that look at IL-4, 5, 13, 17, and other histamine receptor blockers. Inhibition of activators. Is that the only one IgE, or are there more? Well, there are more. We're looking at Bruton's tyrosine kinase. We're looking at TSLP complement and MAS-related G protein coupled receptor X2. Now, as for BTK inhibitors, we already have a very nice insight. Yes, it can work in two ways, blocking mast cells and blocking autoantibody production. And for two BTK inhibitors, we know that it works. Fenebrutinib and remibrutinib. What are the new ways of treating? Well, look, we have mast cell silencers that make use of inhibitory mast cell receptors like Siglec-8. And when we use lirentelimab, an antibody that goes and silences mast cells, it also silences chronic urticaria, 75% reduction. And we now also have depleters of mast cells. They work by targeting KIT. KIT is a receptor on mast cells that is needed for mast cells to stay alive. If we block it, the SCF, that is the survival factor, it can no longer bind. Mast cells die, and we can measure this dying of mast cells by the reduction of tryptase, which only comes from mast cells. Now, blocking it stops it, more SCF. What does that do to chronic urticaria? I'll show you two examples. Cold urticaria on the left with the disease activity shown by provocation testing, and symptomatic dermographism on the right. Again, disease activity as shown by provocation threshold testing. And you can see that gray arrow that goes down. That's when we applied CDX0159, an anti-KIT antibody. And you can see the disease activity drops rapidly and dramatically. CDX0159 is now called barzolvolimab. And you can see for cold urticaria on the left and symptomatic dermographism on the right, virtually all of these patients are complete responders when their mast cells are depleted. And depleted they are. Look, on the left you can see the reduction in mast cell numbers in the skin at 1, 4, 8, and 12 weeks after treatment. On the right, you can see the corresponding tryptase levels. So let me summarize. How can we improve on the management of patients with chronic urticaria? Well, one is a better, more comprehensive diagnostic approach. Diagnose earlier, reduce misdiagnosis, look for consequences, comorbidities, and underlying causes, and most importantly, measure disease activity, because that gives you the information you need to treat. And we monitor that treatment with the UCT or the IECT, the IECT. And we treat until urticaria is gone. We don't stop short, and we step up, optimize, and step down when it is time. Looking forward to novel treatment options that help us do this even better. I want to end with a big shout out to the Urticaria Centers of Reference and Excellence. Go check out what this ever-growing network of urticaria centers does. One thing we do is we have a registry with more than 4,000 patients already that you can contribute to. And I do hope to see you all in Berlin. When? December 7 and 8 for the Global Urticaria Forum. This is where we meet to discuss novel insights, strategies, and projects. With that, stay tuned. There will be a question and answer session following soon. Greetings from the Charité UCare and ACare here in Berlin. And if you have a question that we don't have the time to answer, my email is on the bottom. Thank you very much for listening.
I hope you can see why, again, I love working with him. His passion, his, again, simplistic explanation of chronic urticaria, the new guidelines, is really second to none. So we'll go. Any questions, comments about Dr. Moore's presentation? He's excellent. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so much to learn here. Again, thinking about this, not only from just chronic urticaria, but the other conditions oftentimes that, present in similar fashion. And some of the same mast cells, silencers, and depleters that are being explored in urticaria are being explored in other therapeutic areas as well. So I think there's just, again, so much hope in this space. What I would say, the one takeaway that I always get from his presentation that reinforces to me is that perfect can't be the enemy of good, and that complete control is possible. Complete control. Like most urticaria patients that I have talked with or spent time with, that is beyond their comprehension at the level that they're currently being managed. And to think that for a disease that you wake up and never know when you might have a flare or how it might be impacting your life, to gain a little bit of control or have that thought of complete control is one that is so incredibly empowering and exciting. And I think we're going to get there with a lot of these new approaches. So other questions, thoughts, maybe online? Anything? Gundula? If you will just say your name, where in the organization. Yeah.
My name is Gundula Kubelmiller from Austria, from the Lung Union. Hi, everybody. I was wondering, because he said step up, step up, step up, is as long until the therapy works. So how or when do I decide that this is a non-responder? Because it's kind of difficult.
Yeah, so I think if I go back to what he said, first of all, we know that it can take up to 6 months to see response. So don't discontinue. What he would say, I've heard him say this before, is don't discontinue too early. Give it at least 6 months of trial before making that decision and saying they're a non-responder. And that's hard when we're talking about, again, people who are living with really a pretty debilitating disease with high holistic impact. I mean, when I think, again, I love the infographic that he shares around the impact of chronic urticaria and on mental health and sexual intimacy and all work. I know so many CU patients who can't even function in their daily lives as a result of the unpredictability of the flares. So, but 6 months is what's recommended. Thank you. Other questions?
It's just a reflection, not a question. We have so Dr. Maurer, it's the man of urticaria chronically around the world. But it's. I want to say the importance of the ultimate investigations of all kind of diseases, because I was 1 year ago viewing another video of Dr. Maurer, and it was very completely different. So in 1 year, that evolves so much and give us, to the urticaria chronicle people, hope. That's the more important word in an association of people of any kind of disease, hope. It's the chronic urticaria, it's maybe one of the hopeful diseases because it's itchy. 24 hours, 7 days a week. Itchy. and you don't have a trigger to pull off, to eliminate the it's a disease of secrets. You didn't talk to another people what you feel, because it's very, in many cases, it affects your sexual life, your intimacy. So it's a disease of secrets. And desesperación es despair, and it's despairing because you can't take it off. So every time Dr. Muraro opens his mouth is for us a word of hope. So thank you.
Yes. Well, and again, Dr. Muraro, it may be around over the next day or two, but definitely we'll see him in December. And please convey that to him, because I often think, again, for a rare disease to have such a champion who is so patient-centered, who consistently is providing hope. But you're right, the science here is evolving so quickly, and that level of excitement around the hope and the solutions that are coming, I mean, are just really, I can't believe we're on the brink of this for the community. So thank you for sharing that. And again, what a responsibility we have, but listen to those same themes. Even if you're not in chronic urticaria, the same themes are across all of our chronic diseases. The impact of itch on atopic dermatitis patients is unbelievable, right? And we hear it all the time, and the disruption of sleep, the disruption of social activities, all of those things. Like, these are the things that we hear, right? We hear the same thing in the COPD community around just the way it isolates you and creates the impact on your social circle that perhaps is really underscored in most of the conversations. So that burden is so much broader. All right, anything else from the audience? Okay, then we will move into our update on the GINA guidelines from 2022, and this will be provided by Dr. Ensham Anajay Arora, Senior Pulmonologist with Oro Health from India.
Welcome everybody. I welcome you again to another session of Pulmonology Read Aloud. My name is Dr. Anshamani Arora. I'm a practicing pulmonologist in Gurgaon, India, and I am presenting the Read Aloud for GINA Guidelines 2022 today. So the Global Initiative for Asthma Committee reviews its guidelines twice every year and presents an updated report on managing asthma. And we'll be discussing about the recent 2022 guideline change. This is an easy to download article, easy to download PPT, which is available on the GINA guideline website. You can go and download the full GINA report, the changes, and even a PDF of changes line by line, page to page, in an exhaustive manner. But today my job is to read quickly the current guideline changes so that you and I are aware of how to incorporate it in our practice. So let's get started. So the GINA guidelines has given a lot of emphasis on the correct diagnosis of asthma. It's important to recognize that whenever we are diagnosing anybody with asthma, we must have a demonstrable variability in the respiratory symptoms, whether this is seasonal, whether it is diurnal, or whether it is pre and post bronchodilatory medication. And it is important to demonstrate this variability in expiratory flow limitation by testing. GINA guidelines take this factor into account, that spirometry pre and post bronchodilator is one of the most accessible and useful tests for testing variability in airflow and should be available universally. They also lay emphasis that you must try to first diagnose the patient and test him before treating whenever possible. However, if a patient lands up in an exacerbation or an acute condition, we may delay this, but whenever possible, please try to test and prove the diagnosis. This is the flow chart which gives us a detailed view of how to diagnose any patient suspected of asthma. So, let me summarize this quickly. So, if a patient with respiratory symptoms like cough, breathlessness, chest tightness and wheezing comes to you and you feel that the symptoms are suspected for asthma, you take a detailed history and see if it supports asthma. If it does, if your patient is already taking some controller treatment from outside, if he is already on a combination inhaler, then in that case, you will have to change your approach to diagnosing him. You will have to still perform the diagnostic testing after stopping the inhalers for the particular time, which we'll discuss later. But if he is a treatment naive patient, you should try to perform spirometry. If that is not available and it's a limited resource setting, at least do a peak flow reading and check for reversibility. Now, if your spirometry or PF reading supports asthma diagnosis, you treat him. If you are not seeing a patient who is a new patient and this patient has come to you with an exacerbation but he's already on certain medication, you treat the clinical urgency with empiric treatment for asthma and then you have to review his response. Once he's better, you have to do diagnostic testing, but preferably do this test within 1 to 3 months of first presentation to you. Now, if this patient did a spirometry but the results do not show a variability or an improvement in bronchodilator response, you have to suspect other diagnosis, do other testing, and if the diagnosis is still not confirmed based on our two most important factors of variability in history and variability in airflow on demonstration and testing, you must consider alternative diagnosis treatment. If your patient does not have a typical history of asthma, right away go for other causes of breathlessness and try to treat them. So this is how in a nutshell you would treat a patient who has come to you for the first time with respiratory symptoms suspected for asthma. Now, what if this patient is already on some form of treatment? He has been prescribed inhalers but comes to you, and you as a specialist want to confirm and prove that his diagnosis is correct. So, if this patient does give a variable airflow limitation, testing history, and his symptoms keep changing throughout the year, then the diagnosis should be confirmed, and then you can assess what is his level of control and see whether his controller treatment is in the right direction. Now, this patient does have a history such as suspected, but there is no airflow limitation which is variable on PFT. What would you do? So, if the PFT does not support your diagnosis, you consider repeating the spirometry. And how will we repeat the spirometry? We have to withhold our bronchodilators, and this is a very important takeaway point here. You have to withhold the bronchodilators. So remember that this has to be done for 4 hours for a short-acting beta agonist. So he's on Asthalin, he's on salbutamol, he's on ipratropium. Stop it for 4 hours. If he's taking twice daily ICS LABA combination, stop it for 24 hours before coming to you if it's twice daily. And if he's taking the longer acting, ultra long acting ICS LABA combinations, stop it for 36 hours. Or when the patient has come to us for during symptoms, then again you may prefer to test him later. Between visits, we have to check whether the patient is having a good variability in FEV1 and there is a responsiveness to bronchodilator. Now we've done all of it, yet his PFT comes normal. Then we're probably not dealing with asthma. Let's go to other diagnosis. Now, if this patient undergoes PFT and we find that he has a very good FEV1, so it is more than 70% predicted, it is not low, what shall we do? We should step down his controller to avoid giving him over medication because his FEV1 is good, and then we must reassess him within a month and see whether this stepping down is causing any harm or the patient is still stable. They also mention considering a bronchial provocation test or repeating bronchodilator responsiveness to confirm your diagnosis in these patients. If, however, the patient has a reduced FEV1 on your testing, then step up his controllers. And how long? Another very important point, for 3 months. Give him a better dose of a controller for 3 months, and then only you shall step down it later, right? And reassess his symptoms. If there is no response, resume the previous treatment. So this is a very, very important slide to understand how to manage our patients. Now, if this patient came to us with fewer respiratory symptoms and his lung function was also normal and the PFT did not demonstrate any variability in airflow, what do we do? Now again, you still are suspecting asthma. Please repeat the bronchodilator responsiveness test again, but withhold the bronchodilators as noted earlier and then only repeat the PFT. If this patient still has a normal report, please step down the controller. Do not give him excess steroids. And now if his symptoms re-emerge and we see that in next visit his lung functions are failing, then even if this patient had a normal initial report, his asthma is confirmed, go back to the previous effective dose of controller, the least effective dose of controller. Now if you step down this patient on controllers and the patient was all right and he did not have any increased symptoms, then cease the controller because your PFT is normal, there is not much evidence of variable symptoms, patient did not deteriorate on reducing the controller, so stop it and monitor him closely. For how long? For at least 1 year, so that you take into account all seasonal variations. However, the fourth group of patient may be a patient who is coming with persistent breathlessness, persistent airflow limitation despite treatment. Then step up the controller. How long? Again 3 months. Reassess, and recheck the lung function. Now you have stepped up, he is not responding anymore. Then probably you should give him the same treatment dose that he was earlier receiving before stepping up, because the step up did not help him. And now you diagnose and investigate him for other possibilities, including an overlap with COPD, including assessment for severe asthma. So this is one take-home slide which we have to remember. Remember the 4-hour SABA, the 24-hour for ICS LABA, and the 36-hour withhold for ultra LABA and ICS. Coming to peak flowmetry. So in a resource-limited environment, GINA acknowledges that all countries may not have accessibility to spirometry everywhere. Expiratory flow readings can be taken into account. And here, when you are looking for response, then a more than 20% increase in the PEF 15 minutes after 2 puffs of salbutamol. So it's like a post-bronchodilatory test. We are looking for more than 20% PEF improvement as compared to 12% or 200 ml in a pulmonary function test in the spirometry, then asthma is likely. And once you send this patient home, he comes back to you, he should have a better improvement in symptoms and PEF after 4 weeks of treatment. So this is also one way in which we can establish and confirm a diagnosis and manage our patients. Let's come to the treatment algorithm. This beautiful algorithm has been there with GINA. We've always had it in every change, every update, and this year as well, this algorithm has been presented to us with a few additions. So let's look at it in a glimpse, and then let's divide it and see what it says. So when we are treating patients who are adults and adolescents above 12 years, there are two tracks which have been recommended, which were there also in the previous statement, track 1 and track 2. So if I go back to this slide, then you will see that there are two tracks that we can really look at. Now, the track 1 is the preferred track, and this track says that even mild asthmatics have to be started on low dose ICS formoterol. So ICS LABA low dose as reliever. That is the preferred strategy. So a lot of emphasis and a lot of importance is being laid on the point that short-acting broncho beta agonists are not your preferred reliever anymore. Do not tell your patient to use a SABA SOS. Do not tell him that he must take this SABA every time he feels an increase in symptoms. That is no longer the right approach. And point and again, the guidelines emphasize that the preferred strategy for reliever will be a low dose ICS and formoterol, rather MART therapy, single inhaler for maintenance and relief therapy. Why? Because that reduces the risk of exacerbations, that reduces the risk of progression of the exacerbation, and patient has a similar symptom control even immediately, and he has a good lung function improvement, and there's enough evidence to support that SABA SOS is not to be used for managing exacerbations even in so-called mild asthmatics. The track 2 is the other track, which is the optional track, but a lot of importance is attached to the point that this alternative track is a non-preferred strategy. We do not want to use SABA as the reliever in our patients, but this option of a track 2 has been given where SABA can be used but is not preferred. And why? Because it is less effective. 2, we would not want to risk further progression of exacerbations and therefore mortalities in asthma. So use track 2 only if track 1 is not possible, and also consider track 2 only if patient is otherwise well acquainted with his controller, he knows how to use it, and he's very stable. He would rather not even require it. You're just mentioning it because you want to tell him about a reliever. And before we consider this regimen with a SABA reliever, please consider whether this patient will be adherent with the controller. He should not become over-dependent on the SABA is the point to drive home. And if they are still using the SABA too much for relief and avoiding controller, they are at risk of SABA only treatments. And what about the other medications, the other controllers? They have limited indications, lesser efficacy, so track 1 and track 2 still remain our primary treatment, track 1 majorly. The newer change that has been added this year in this flowchart is also of step 5. In step 5, a newer class of biologic therapy has been added, and which the step 5 already had the provision of adding a LAMA, which we have seen. We have also seen a role of triple therapy in asthma in step 5, and this was already there. But the newer therapy that has been added in biologics is anti-TSLP. Anti-TSLP is anti-thymic stromal lymphopoietin. So thymic stromal lymphopoietin is a cytokine basically, and this mediates the signaling for inflammation. And if we are able to stop this, the release of cytokines and the Th2 inflammation in asthma, by blocking this, then we may achieve a better cure. And that's how anti-TSLP tezepelumab has been added in step 5, still not available in India. Anti-IL-4 dupilumab has also been added. We already were having anti-IgE omalizumab and anti-IL-5 benralizumab options previously. So add on the LAMA, assess the phenotype, consider a high-dose maintenance ICS formoterol, and this new biologic may also be considered in step 5 in future. Now let's talk about personalized asthma management. Let's break down the flowchart that was given into individual components. Remember, for all your patients, assess the patient, adjust the dose every time you assess, and review the response. So confirm the diagnosis, very important. Control the symptoms, risk factors, comorbidities, adjust the dose, treat the risk factors, give other strategies. Make sure you're adjusting up and down between the tracks or between the doses, and keep reviewing the patients for side effects, exacerbations, and symptoms. In adults and adolescents, preferred track, controller, preferred reliever will be ICS formoterol. Step 1, step 2, no more SABA, only as needed low dose ICS formoterol as controller and reliever. Step 3, low dose maintenance instead of as needed, maintenance ICS formoterol. Step 4, medium dose maintenance ICS formoterol. And step 5, as we discussed. In the alternative strategy, track 2, before considering, make sure he still takes his daily controller. Here, step 1, take ICS whenever you are taking SABA. So if you're using SABA SOS, please do not forget to take your controller. For reliever, then you can add as needed SABA. Remember, this is not preferred strategy. Step 2, low dose maintenance ICS. Step 3, low dose maintenance ICS with LABA. Step 4, medium to high dose maintenance ICS and LABA. And step 5 is the same. Now, other controller options, do not depend on them. Another thing to drive home, do not depend on additional options like LTRAs, add-on LTRAs, add-on slits only for management. So low dose ICS, whenever SABA is taken, to be given. Daily LTRA is additional option, less efficacious, and addition of sublingual immunotherapy for house dust mite is also an additional controller. Here we go to medium dose ICS, or we add LAMA in the next step, or LTRA, or house dust mite sublingual immunotherapy, or we switch to a higher dose of ICS. And in step 5, they mentioned addition of azithromycin in adults, or addition of regular LTRA, leukotriene receptor antagonist like montelukast. As a last resort, adding low dose oral corticosteroids, but this is not the preferred strategy. Why should we not treat with SABA alone? The guideline mentions time and again that this fundamental change, which was brought about in 2019, continues to hold true with newer meta-analyses coming. Regular use of SABA, even for up to 2 weeks, will cause increased airway hyperresponsiveness, reduction in the effect of the bronchodilators, increase in allergic response, and eosinophils. So do not use SABA too much. It will cause more exacerbation, poorer control of asthma, and more mortality. The evidence comes primarily from Sigma trials, Sigma 1 and Sigma 2 trials, where the rate of severe exacerbation was more in patients who were taking as needed SABA, in this case terbutaline, compared to as needed budesonide and formoterol. And the newer evidence on as-needed ICS formoterol also comes from Bateman study 2021 and the Beasley group of 2019, where they have mentioned that if a patient is taking as-needed budesonide and formoterol, then the number of exacerbations annually will be lesser as compared to the patient who's not doing so. And we can see it in both the groups. So a lower risk of exacerbations compared to daily ICS plus as needed SABA. What are the changes newer in the recommendations? The recommendations mention that LAMA should not be used as asthma monotherapy. And when you add LAMA to ICS LABA, you should acknowledge the fact that LAMA is not going to increase the lung function too much. LAMA is not going to improve the benefit of symptom too much. So do not give it only for symptomatic relief. It will cause a modest reduction in exacerbations, but make sure they are on the right dose of ICS LABA before you add your LAMA. And recently, all chromone PMDIs have been discontinued in asthma management. This is a separate entity within the 2022 guidelines, which is the GINA guide for difficult to treat and severe asthma. It's beyond the purview of today's talk, and maybe I can make another video and read aloud on this. Please let me know in the comment section if you would like to have this video. Let's come to changes in treatment in 6 to 11 years old. This is a glimpse of how it looks like. Let's dissect it and see it individually. Major changes are that when you're treating patients 6 years and above, then controllers have very limited indications and will not be preferred. And in the 6 to 11 year age group, again in step 5, there is an approval for dupilumab anti-IL-4 for children with severe eosinophilic Th2 asthma who are not on oral steroids. And please consider oral corticosteroids as maintenance for children only as a last resort when everything fails. Coming to the individual parts of the flowchart, again like adults, assess, adjust and review the child at each visit. The step 1 involves preferred strategy, low dose ICS whenever your SABA is being taken. And other controller option would include daily low dose ICS. But these patients can use as needed short-acting beta agonist or as needed ICS formoterol reliever in MART therapy if they are already in step 3 and 4. So again, in children like adults, you can still use the ICS formoterol if they are already in step 3-4. You can use SABA SOS if they are in the lower steps, and the preferred will be whenever you're giving SABA, give a low dose ICS. Step 2, daily the child should be taking a low dose inhaled corticosteroid. This is not with LABA, it's just inhaled corticosteroid. Daily the child should be taking a low dose inhaled corticosteroid. This is not with LABA, it's just inhaled corticosteroid. And other controllers have limited role like leukotriene receptor antagonists or low dose ICS plus SABA. Step 3, preferred will be that this patient should now be on low dose ICS with LABA or a medium dose of ICS or a very low dose ICS formoterol maintenance MART therapy, right? And step 4, you increase the dose to a medium dose of ICS LABA or a low dose of maintenance and reliever. And step 5, children should be assessed for phenotype. A higher dose of ICS LABA can be given, and 2 therapies are recommended now for children in biologics: anti-IgE omalizumab and anti-IL-4 dupilumab. But again, they are to be added as a last resort once we have made sure that all the steps have been taken care of. What about VZ preschool children who are less than 5? We see a lot of them even as adult pulmonologists. Remember that if these patients do not have interval symptoms and they just come to you with a VZ episode for an opinion, you can give intermittent short courses of inhaled corticosteroids along with the SABA. but only give intermittent short ICS if you know that this will be used appropriately. We do not want the child to be on a long-lasting inhaled corticosteroid in such an age, and oral bronchodilatory therapy, oral salbutamol therapy is not recommended. For 5 years and below, this is how the flowchart looks like. Much similar, but you can consider intermittent short courses just when he has a wheezy viral illness or a Varley as it is called, and we step up with a daily low dose ICS or a double low dose ICS, and in step 4 we continue the controller. And in these patients the dose has to be really taken into consideration, and they've also given in which children you can consider these steps, so how to divide them into steps. Amongst the definitions, a very clear demarcation has been made of severe asthma and difficult to treat asthma. Difficult to treat asthma is the one where you're not able to treat because of other factors like adherence, the technique of inhaler, the comorbidities. But severe asthma is the umbrella where the disease is remaining uncontrolled despite your optimized treatment, and we are giving a high dose of ICS/LABA so that it doesn't become uncontrolled. And a lot of emphasis has been given on mild asthma definition, and for mild asthma, it is the asthma which is well controlled on a low dose ICS or as needed ICS for Referral. But patients and clinicians should not assume that mild asthma means no risk and no controller. Mild asthma means it is well controlled. So do not be over dependent on SABAs, because up to 30% asthma deaths can occur in patients who have infrequent symptoms, and rather the GINA guidelines say that the term mild asthma may be avoided because it gives a false impression of a milder disease. Other important points are that a written asthma action plan should be given, so a customized asthma action plan, not just verbally telling the patient. In an acute setting, though salbutamol is usually used for immediate nebulization, formoterol has a similar efficacy. It can be used in emergency department, and budesonide formoterol combination can have as good efficacy and safety as a SABA. And air filters or purifiers can be recommended to asthmatic patients, but there's still no evidence of a consistent benefit on asthma outcomes. And another point mention is that e-cigarettes will have increased respiratory symptoms and asthma exacerbation. Then, just like the severe asthma, there is another guidance given on COVID-19 and asthma, which can be again downloaded easily. The main points are that patients with asthma are not at an increased risk of COVID-19. They are not at an increased risk of death if they are well controlled, so they must be encouraged to use good asthma management. Note has been made about nebulizers to be avoided in general care settings for patients with asthma because of risk of aerosol dissemination. And rather, it's been noted that there have been decreased asthma exacerbations somehow worldwide during the pandemic, and this could be because the patients have been more indoors. So this is all from me today. We have read aloud the changes in the guidelines, the main points of the guidelines. Do download the guideline, read the report. It is a very good article, and keep reading. Thank you for your patient listening.
Such a good overview of the guidelines. A couple of takeaways. Number one, I think that for those that are part of our community that focus on asthma, it's important. GINA 2022, if I were to boil it down to a couple of things, number one, no SABA alone. No patient should be managed on SABA alone. We know that it increases the risk of death and exacerbation. So no SABA alone, no quick relief alone. Number two, the inclusion of TSLP in step 5 for adults, a new higher in the allergic cascade method to address severe asthma, step 5. And then number 3 is OCS last resort. Now this was in GINA 2020, and we're so excited about that because we'll talk a little bit about our steroid stewardship efforts and our desire to reduce systemic steroids in respiratory. But GINA 2022 goes a step further and says absolutely OCS last resort. Even biologics should be tried before continuous OCS. So that's, if I were to boil it down, everything that we just heard for adults, that's the key takeaway. Children 6 to 11, the addition of dupilumab is an important one, a new biologic for the more uncontrolled step 5 asthma patient. And then the other thing is, again, no SABA alone, ICS for Muraro, what we call MART therapy. Instead of just taking a quick relief medicine, you always take controller. So always take controller and relief at the same time, okay? So that's like the bottom line. The questions, because most of you know, but I'll reinforce, I am the GINA patient advisor, so I get to be in all those conversations about how the global guidelines for asthma are being updated. The big question that I think will be coming forth in 2022 is that what she alluded to at the end. Do we eliminate all discussion of mild asthma? There's some discussion of like, is mild asthma even a thing, right? And there is debate. The data is not clear. The experts do not agree today, but I think that that's what will likely be taken up in the next update. So more to come there. Any questions, comments about the GINA updates? Nothing online either? Okay, great. Well, then we will keep powering through to our last presentation of the scientific meeting, which is the update on the GOLD guidelines. And this will be brought to us by Dr. Daniel Ray of North Shore University Health System in Chicago in the United States. He is part of the GOLD guidelines committee, and Dr. Ray will provide us with the update for 2022.
I'm going to go through the evidence-based guidelines put out by the Global Initiative for Chronic Obstructive Lung Disease, which is a not-for-profit organization that was put in place about 20 years ago by the WHO. So it's been changing over time. And so these guidelines have been updated repeatedly, and they've in the last 10 years have really diverged from guidelines for treatment of asthma. And so I just wanted to kind of point some of those changes out. So most of the evidence that they cite is of high quality, multiple randomized controlled trials, or if less than that, if it's smaller randomized controlled trials or meta-analysis, but they use high quality evidence to base their guidelines. As you're aware, the principal cause of COPD is smoking, but pollutants do play a role, as well as host factors. So the two combined can predispose a person to COPD. That smoke in turn can impair lung growth in children that are in homes with smokers, and in adults. It accelerates the decline in lung function, causing lung injury and systemic inflammation. The pathology resulting from that mostly involves the small airways with narrowing, thickening, but also destruction of the elastic tissue of the lung, generating emphysematous changes, and also systemic effects, so weight loss, often seen in late stage COPD. And then clinically, you're well aware of the manifestations. People are short of breath. They have frequent exacerbations. They have comorbidities, heart disease being one of them. And they have significant airflow limitation on spirometry. So our lung function peaks at around age 20, and it's all downhill from there, as you probably are already starting to experience. Although fortunately for our lungs, there's a lot of capacitance. So even though the lung function is declining with time, we don't become symptomatic unless we have significant exposures to smoke and host factors that lead to an accelerated decline in lung function. So starting about the 5th and 6th decade, we begin to see people become symptomatic because of this decreasing lung function. If you have small lungs to begin with, you grew up in a household with smokers, you had other childhood respiratory illnesses, you're starting at a lower lung function and you don't have to decline as far before you're symptomatic. So I like to point this out to my smokers, saying if we stop here, say at age 40, we stop smoking, this accelerated rate of decline actually levels out and it becomes the normal rate of decline, extending by decades the time until they become symptomatic from their obstructive lung disease. So the sooner they quit, the better. We make a diagnosis of COPD by either looking for people that have symptoms, say shortness of breath or cough, or risk factors. They're a smoker or they have significant family history. And then we do spirometry looking for obstruction. So really the key to the diagnosis is obstruction on spirometry, but we get there by recognizing people with risk factors or people with symptoms that might have the disease. The symptoms, most of the time it's shortness of breath. It's progressive over time and worse with exercise. They can have cough that can be intermittent or continuous. They can be productive or non-productive. As you know, the chronic bronchitic pattern often has daily sputum production, at least for months at a time. Our patients with COPD tend to have more respiratory infections and more symptomatic from them. And then if you combine that with our host factors, tobacco smoke exposure, home smoke exposure, say over cooking fires, or occupational exposures, and then they have obstruction on spirometry, then they have COPD. Other things mimic COPD, primarily asthma. The key differentiating factors include the earlier onset of symptoms that we generally see with asthmatics. The symptoms can be more variable. They'll have weeks where they're symptomatic and weeks where they're not. They may have that diurnal variation in symptoms. They have a history of allergies, a family history of asthma, and they tend to be more obese. So, but as you're well aware, I see hands raised already. There are a lot of people that have asthma that smoke as well, and it's hard to kind of figure out where they fall in this spectrum. And in fact, we recognize that, and we call it asthma COPD overlap. Just as a caveat, our treatment generally is directed towards what they resemble the most. So if their symptoms came on earlier, they've had lots of allergies, they have recurrent allergic rhinitis, say they're obese, you might treat them more as an asthmatic and in terms of your algorithm rather than COPD. And the opposite is true if you have somebody that really doesn't have a history of allergies, did have asthma as a child, but then smoked for 40 years and now it's progressively shorter breath. So other things that can generate similar symptoms might be your elderly hypertensive patients with diastolic heart failure. So heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. They get shorter breath walking around. And if they're a smoker, you might think, well, they could have COPD, but you won't know that unless you do spirometry. Bronchiectasis, people that have chronic productive coughs can seem like they have chronic bronchitis, but in fact, on X-ray or CT scan, you'll see evidence of bronchiectasis. And then lastly, in our high-risk populations, we always have to think about tuberculosis causing cough, wheezing, and some shortness of breath. So as we said, spirometry is necessary for diagnosis. It also allows you to assess how severe their obstruction is. And in some cases, you can use it when you're testing out different therapies. Doing spirometry is really hard. And especially if you haven't been doing them for 2 years in your office because of COVID, getting back to doing them and doing them correctly is a little bit difficult. Everybody has to be retrained. The people doing the spirometry need to be calibrating your machine on a daily basis. If you're doing spirometry after bronchodilators, you have to allow that 10 or 15 minutes for the bronchodilator to work before you retest. And then the patient has to give that really good effort, the complete breath in, the forcible exhale all the way out till they can't blow out anymore. They have to have a good seal around the mouthpiece. They have to be able to repeat that at least 3 times with less than a 5% variation in their FVC and FEV1 to be a valid test. So doing this is hard. Oftentimes it takes 4, 5, 6 efforts before you have 3 good ones where you have a nice smooth curve and the patient clearly has blown everything out. I found that I actually just had to do the spirometry myself to show the patient how to do them before I would coax them through it. In any case, if you're able to get these 3 good curves, then and the ratio of their FEV1 to FVC is less than 0.7, they have significant airflow limitation. And with the appropriate symptoms or risk factors, you can feel certain of your diagnosis of COPD. So examples of spirometry, you've seen in a normal spirometry, most of the time patients have fully exhaled by about 2 seconds. And in obstructive lung function, patients still exhaling after 4, 5, 6 seconds. In fact, clinically, if you have your stethoscope on the patient's chest and you have them forcibly exhale and you still hear expiratory breath sounds at 6 seconds, they have COPD unless they're closing their glottis. So another thing to watch for is when they're exhaling, make sure they do it with an open glottis, that they're not going generating a wheeze from their upper airway. Once you've done your spirometry, you can go back and look at the FEV1 in order to grade the severity of the obstruction. And so GOLD has a series of classifications, 1, 2, 3, and 4, with decreasing FEV1. Your moderate, severe, and very severe are important in that this would qualify a patient, for example, for pulmonary rehabilitation. In your severe and very severe obstruction, if you have somebody that's symptomatic to the point they can't work, then they would be able to apply for disability with this level of airflow obstruction. But the interesting thing is that this level of obstruction doesn't necessarily correspond to their symptoms or to the frequency of their exacerbations of COPD. And therefore, treatment is not determined by the severity of their obstruction. Treatment rather is determined by their symptoms and their frequency of their exacerbations. So the best way to look at symptoms is with these simple scores. There's the Medical Research Council dyspnea scale, going from shortness of breath with strenuous exercise to shortness of breath getting dressed. So is the level of shortness of breath worsens, their MRC grade increases. There's another scoring system called the COPD assessment test. It looks at breathlessness as well as cough and general sense of well-being to generate a score. So you've got a patient with risk factors, you do spirometry, you confirm the diagnosis, you look at the severity of their airflow obstruction, but the way you determine their therapy is by looking at a combination of how many exacerbations they've experienced or hospitalizations and how many symptoms they're experiencing. So that gives you these grade A, B, C, and D categories for the gold categories by which you can then stepwise increase your medical therapy. So as an example, the gold A class is 1 or less exacerbations and symptom scores that are very mild. These would be patients that have intermittent symptoms or very minimal symptoms and are not having exacerbations of cough, congestion, shortness of breath that require treatment. So if they start to have more symptoms, daily symptoms, for example, but not frequent exacerbations, it's class B. And then as they start to have increasing exacerbations with minimal symptoms, class C. And then our most severe patients symptomatically will have frequent exacerbations and daily or severe symptoms. So treatment's going to be based on this scoring system. The group A, mild patients, minimal symptoms, should have a bronchodilator, either a short-acting bronchodilator if they have truly minimal, if any, symptoms, or a long-acting bronchodilator if they have more frequent symptoms. Group B also should have, everybody now should have a short-acting bronchodilator for acute flare-ups, but our group B is going to have a long-acting bronchodilator, and that can be either a long-acting beta agonist or a long-acting muscarinic antagonist on a daily basis to help control their symptoms. And then if they're starting to have more frequent exacerbations, then at a minimum, they need to be on a LAMA, long-acting muscarinic antagonist, and I'll explain why, or a combination LABA-LAMA. And then on our most symptomatic patients, they should be on a LABA-LAMA and potentially on an inhaled corticosteroid. So this is the group where we're going to treat with inhaled corticosteroids, but we're going to also fine-tune that based on their eosinophil count and their history of pneumonias. So the one thing about inhaled corticosteroids and COPD is that it is associated with an increase in pneumonias. We don't want to give it in patients that have frequent pneumonias and or potentially don't benefit from inhaled corticosteroids, which tend to be patients that have very little eosinophilic inflammation of the airway. So is absolute eosinophil counts of less than 100. Here are inhalers. The most important thing to know is that within a class, one drug versus the other is really not different. The most important thing for your patient is going to be the cost of the medication. So probably the key driver of compliance to using inhalers is going to be their expense. They're incredibly expensive. The cost of these things have continued to rise. Every few years, the drug companies tweak their device, even though the drugs can be quite old. They tweak their device, they keep their patent, and they're able to escalate the cost. So you need to look for each patient, depending on their insurance, what drugs are covered in the formulary that they can get at the lowest cost. So You have short-acting beta agonists, short-acting muscarinic antagonists. The one you choose is really going to be based on the formulary or the availability of generic. You have long-acting beta agonists, you have long-acting muscarinic antagonists, you have combinations, the dual inhalers, LABA/LAMAs. You have inhaled corticosteroids along with a long-acting beta agonist, and then you have the triple combination, LABA/LAMA inhaled corticosteroids. Depending which class you need, then look on the formulary which is going to be least expensive for your patient. The evidence for use of the medication includes improvement in symptom management with inhaled bronchodilators, short-acting beta agonists and muscarinic antagonists improve the FEV1 and symptoms. So that's, everybody really should have a short-acting inhaler. And if it's the same cost, the combination of short-acting beta agonists and muscarinic antagonists is better than either of these individually. But even better than the short-acting bronchodilators are the long-acting beta agonists and long-acting muscarinic antagonists. They all improve lung function, shortness of breath, health status. They reduce exacerbations. And then key is that the long-acting muscarinic antagonists have a greater effect reducing exacerbations compared to long-acting beta agonists, and they decrease hospitalization. So if you've got somebody having frequent exacerbations, at a minimum, they need to be on the LAMA. But even better is if you combine that LAMA with LABA. So dual inhalers are better than individual inhalers alone. And the combination therapy with LABA/LAMAs reduces exacerbations compared to monotherapy. So short-acting inhalers, dual inhalers, short-acting is better than single. Long-acting bronchodilators, the mainstay of therapy for COPD. And of the two, the muscarinic antagonists decrease exacerbations relative to the long-acting beta agonists. And then combinations of both of these are better than either one alone, which is what this says. LABAs and LAMAs preferred over short-acting agents. You can start somebody on a long-acting bronchodilator and increase that to a dual long-acting bronchodilator if they continue to be symptomatic. So inhaled corticosteroids, just kind of going over the evidence. It's when you combine an inhaled corticosteroid with a long-acting beta agonist, that's better in reducing exacerbations in patients with moderate to severe COPD. So it's going to be that group C and D patients, primarily group D, so patients that are having symptoms and frequent exacerbations, they should be on an inhaled corticosteroid unless they're having frequent pneumonias. Or the other thing to consider is whether or not they have evidence of allergic inflammation and elevation in eosinophil counts. Long-term oral glucocorticoids, not good, which is not to say that some patients may not end up on this eventually, but they have lots of side effects and there's not really any convincing evidence that it's helpful in the long run for these patients. There are other anti-inflammatories that are helpful. So the PDE4 inhibitors, roflumilast, for example, can help patients with frequent exacerbations, as well as long-term oral antibiotic therapy. So azithromycin 3 times a week for a year in our patients with severe bronchitis and COPD. Trying to distill that down to when do you use inhaled corticosteroids and when you don't. So you've got a lot of support in patients that are hospitalized with COPD or have frequent exacerbations in a given year with COPD, and have blood eosinophils that are elevated, and certainly in our crossover patients, our asthma COPD overlap patients. We're to avoid using it with patients that have had recurrent pneumonias or have minimal eosinophils, or patients that have infection with atypical mycobacterium. So some of our patients have bronchiectasis, they have sputums that are positive for AFB, they're growing out MAI. We try to avoid using inhaled corticosteroids in those patients. The kind of gray zone, in this case yellow zone, that you want to think about adding an inhaled corticosteroid being patients that are having some exacerbations and have at least a modest elevation in blood eosinophils. They're likely to benefit from the addition of an inhaled corticosteroid on top of their long-acting bronchodilator, which is what we've said here. Inhalers are clearly the way to go. There are two major classes of inhalers in terms of the delivery system. There's the meter dose inhalers versus the dry powder inhalers. Some patients do better with one versus the other. You'll have to just see in the office if they're actually capable of doing a dry powder inhaler correctly. If they're not, then they should probably be on the meter dose inhaler. And most classes of the medication have either one or the other type. It is really critical to show them how to use the inhaler when you're prescribing the medicine. Actually watch them use the inhaler to make sure they're using it correctly, and then to bring them back and recheck their inhaler technique, because they'll go home, come back in a week and be using it improperly, and complain that the inhaler doesn't work when they're just not using it right. These are reasonably intelligent people, but the inhalers can be confusing. And then, like I said, the cost is a key driver of compliance. The less expensive, the more likely they are to use it. Otherwise, if it's an expensive inhaler, they'll use it a couple times, and then if they're feeling okay, they won't use it, and then they may use it again, and you won't be able to decide if it's really their compliance that's affecting their or why they're having persistent symptoms versus the drug itself being ineffective. As even more important than which inhaler you choose, of course, is getting the patient to quit smoking. If they haven't already done so, you have to ask them each time they come, are they smoking? You have to tell them they can't smoke. Use every bit of logic you can muster, emotion. Tell them how personally it's hurting you that they're still smoking and you care, and that they're destroying their lungs. And I like to set up a case against these huge international corporations that still produce cigarettes, that are taking their money while they're giving them a product that's hurting them, and point out the cost of this. I mean, I think they're spending probably $50 a carton of cigarettes, of which half of it is going in taxes. So they're paying the government every time they smoke, and probably will get a few people to quit. If they seem like they're going to try to quit, set a quit date, give them choices for adjuvant therapy. So Nicorette gum, you can try oops, I'm just blanked. We're going, and most importantly, just arrange for follow-up to make sure that they're still on path of quitting smoking. Influenza vaccine, of course, in our patients, the COVID vaccine, pneumonia vaccine. So less than 65 years of age, go ahead and give them the 23-valent vaccine, and over 65, give them the Prevnar, the 13-valent vaccine, and then the Tdap boosters. Patients, like I said, that have moderate to severe obstruction, they need to undergo pulmonary rehab. They will benefit from that. And then oxygen therapy. So here's another caveat. A lot of our patients will desaturate when you walk them around in the office. But those patients don't necessarily benefit from home oxygen therapy. So you should limit this oxygen to severe chronic resting arterial hypoxemia. I'll go to that. So that's your patients that are at rest or saturating less than 88%, or between 88 and 90% if they have heart failure or polycythemia. These are really the only patients that benefit from long-term home oxygen therapy. And you'll need to document it for Medicare anyways after 3 months to make sure that they're still hypoxic. The patients that desaturate transiently when you walk around but are above 90% or 88% at rest don't benefit either symptomatically or exacerbations or hospitalizations by treatment with home oxygen. And then finally, keep in mind that patients that have smoked and are older, so this now is age 50 and 20 pack years of smoking history, they should have screening for lung cancer. They run a significant increased risk, upwards of 2 to 4% per year, and mortality is decreased by annual low-dose CT screening. So as we talk about our symptoms, we want to relieve symptoms, we want to improve their exercise tolerance, we want to diminish the progression of their disease, and we want to treat their exacerbations. I'm going to close my door 1 second, forgive me. Just had the cleaning people come in the house. We went through this before. I wanted to just go over it again because this tends to be confusing. So our patients with minimal symptoms and minimal exacerbations, just a bronchodilator, short acting or long acting, as they begin to have more frequent symptoms or daily symptoms, they need to be on a long acting bronchodilator or combination. Our patients that are having 2 or more exacerbations a year or hospitalization need at a minimum to be on a long-acting muscarinic antagonist or a combination. And then our more symptomatic patients with frequent exacerbations or hospitalizations, they would be on a combination of LAMA-LABA and an inhaled corticosteroid if they have an elevation in eosinophils and if they're not having frequent pneumonias. Each time you see them, you're going to review their symptoms, you're going to assess their inhaler technique, and you're going to make adjustments in their therapy. When they have a flare-up in their symptoms, most of the time it's just an exacerbation, but kind of in the back of your mind, make sure that they're not having other things that are mimicking the COPD exacerbation. So if they're having chills and fevers, obviously you're going to be looking for pneumonia. If they had sudden onset of shortness of breath and they have some pain in one side, you're looking for pneumothorax. if on your examination they've got diminished breath soundness or dullness, chest percussion, you might want to look for a pleural effusion. And then in patients that are hospitalized with COPD exacerbation, there's a significant number that are found also to have pulmonary embolism. So it's something to consider, particularly if they have other reasons to have a PE. And then heart failure can kind of look like a COPD exacerbation. In the office, I would occasionally get patients coming in with a worsening shortness of breath, and they would be in new onset of atrial fibrillation. So just other things that kind of mimic what's most common, of course, is COPD exacerbation. Then your patients that are coming in because they're much worse, because you're going to assess them to see if they need to go to the hospital. And I actually think you're probably pretty familiar with when they walk in the office and they look like they need to go to the hospital, they really probably need to go to the hospital. If you are treating them in the office, then you may need access to a chest radiograph, nebulizer for short-acting bronchodilators, putting them on oral corticosteroids and or antibiotics if they have increasing cough, sputum purulence, or fevers. Short-acting bronchodilators are used in our exacerbations. We almost always treat these patients with short-course systemic steroids, so prednisone, either in a fixed dose or a tapering dose over 5 to 7 days, and then frequently antibiotics if they have any sense of infection, usually by an increase in sputum production or increased sputum purulence, but sometimes with fevers. These actually first three things are kind of key to treating these exacerbations. Then lastly, if you want everything I just talked about in a single page, this COPD follow-up checklist kind of does it all, gives you a way to measure their baseline symptoms, any changes, what their maintenance therapy is, their vaccinations, does the patient have a written plan, have they been in the hospital, outside factors that may be contributing to their symptoms or shortness of breath, and then obviously you can put your summary and plans in there.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. So I'll do the same sort of summary because it's a lot of data about the GOLD update. If I were to do the takeaways of GOLD 2022 from a patient perspective, number one, I think that the greater definition around early COPD, mild COPD, young COPD, and pre-COPD are really important. The whole notion of lung function peaks at 20. I believe that lung function should be a fifth vital sign. Every single person on this planet, you don't go to the doctor without getting your blood pressure checked. Why are we not checking lung function? It makes no sense. So I believe that we should be screening and getting that peak lung function at 20 years old by the time someone's 20, because we know it's going to decline thereafter, right? That just naturally that happens. So that definition of those early, mild, young, and pre-COPD, and the importance of screening everyone, knowing that lung function should be what I consider the fifth vital sign. And then the conversation around the addition of LABA for patients who have COPD with blood eosinophils greater than 300. That's the overlap patient, right? That's typically the patient that has some degree of asthma and COPD, and they would respond to a long-acting bronchodilator. So that language was changed and is stronger in this 2022 version. And then COVID, he didn't talk about it much, but COVID vaccine is recommended for all COPD patients. There was some question early on about should they or shouldn't they. And I love the checklist. I think that that's a really great single source document. The other thing I'll say about COPD, which you'll hear a little bit more in our annual general meeting, is exacerbation is a red flag. Breathlessness is not normal. Whether that's in asthma or COPD, breathlessness is not normal, and we need to stop normalizing that. And so I think that that's a key takeaway for me that I heard as I listened to Dr. Ray. One thing I disagree with him is about whatever his comment was about intelligence, reasonably intelligent patients with COPD. Maybe I take offense because my mother is living with COPD and I think she's very intelligent, but about inhaler use, right? Across asthma and COPD, greater than 70% of patients with an inhaler use it incorrectly, okay? That's not on behalf of the person living with the condition. There's something inherently flawed with the design of the products if 7 out of 10 people don't use them correctly. So rather than putting it off on, and I know he did it jokingly, I'm not coming down on Dr. Ray, but I would ask him to never say that again. Rather than coming down or perhaps insulting the reasonable intelligence of people living with COPD, how about we get to addressing the real problem, which is device delivery, right? So as a patient advocate, I'm sorry, I just had to say that because that really didn't sit well with me. Yeah. We do have a question coming from the online community.
It's not a question, it's a comment that's in line with what you just said.
Great.
Comment from Otto Spranger.
Yeah.
He's writing that we need more innovation in the field of devices, that the technology is there.
Yes.
That's what he's saying.
And Otto, we are glad that you're joining us. We wish he was here in person. Otto is our treasurer. He'll join us also for the AGM portion, recovering from hip surgery. We're missing him today, but glad that he's with us online, and I couldn't agree more. The other thing I'll say out of that that sparked something for me is July 1st, tomorrow, the first ever World Bronchiectasis Day. We are so excited about partnering with COPD Foundation and so many of our organizations across the globe to raise awareness about bronchiectasis. And I think that, again, another disease state in our respiratory arena that we are learning more and more about. And today, actually, or tomorrow starts the World Bronchiectasis Congress as well, that's here in Prague. So they are meeting kind of in parallel with our meeting here as well. So lots of work to be done in that space. But anyway, those were my comments from Dr. Ray's that resonated and stuck out. Any comments or questions from anybody else?
Hi, it's Kristen Willard from the COPD Foundation in the United States. So I, of course, took copious notes and have a lot of comments as well. One of the things that struck me that he said was the fact that in this, the current era of COVID, that we are in a position now where HCPs may need to be re-educated on spirometry, which is such an undertaking given that it was difficult to educate people in spirometry before. And it's essential for all of our conditions or many of our conditions we're talking about, that we get to that point, right? And so that seems like a huge opportunity. I'm not aware right now of campaigns that are new to educate on that front, but that seems like something we might be able to work on, all of us together, right? To get information out to HCPs, given that I'm sure they're in a position where they're hungry for it. I think too, I'd also like to talk a little bit about his, when he talked about smoking cessation. I think if you talk to anybody who's ever quit smoking, they'll say it's probably one of the hardest things they'll ever do in their lives, right? We know it takes many, many times on average before people are able to quit. And I think too, I guess everybody has their own approach to it, right? And he shared his. But I think one of the things that can be used is the shared decision making that everyone is now learning to employ or hearing about if they're not employing it yet, as a way to move that forward with a particular patient, right? And I think also asking them about their goals, right? What goals do they have for that they're striving for, that quitting smoking could help them to get to, I think would be really important. And then the other thing came back to a comment that you made earlier when he was talking through all these things that are available to patients, these medications, of course, and pulmonary rehab. And I was thinking about the access issues that people have. It might not be crossing into another country as was your situation, but cost access or insurance access in the United States are prohibitive for many people, and the fact that maybe their providers don't know about pulmonary rehab to begin with.
Most countries don't even offer pulmonary rehab.
Right,
really
we're
is,
lucky. Right. And then
we had it in Serbia, but yes, for the patients.
In my country, at least in my town, but in my town there is a huge pulmonary clinic, so it's maybe not representative example, but we have pulmonary recovery, rehabilitation, but actually what is maybe not so good that we do have that opportunity, but the patients do not reach for it. Actually, they decline to go because it's time consuming for them, and they are not maybe well educated by the doctors. What is the benefit from that? So here in my country, in my town, we have that opportunity. It's free of charge. It's funded by the state. So it's important, yes, because our healthcare system is different than in US.
I think one of the things that we have advocated for and tried to advance is the use of like on-demand telehealth pulmonary rehab, rather, or organized pulmonary rehab using digital solutions, because I agree with you. Even when we remove some of the cost barriers, people's understanding of the benefit and their willingness to incorporate it into their overall life is not always optimal. Yes. And again, I'm living this with my own mom, and so we have this conversation all the time about why aren't you doing maybe some of the things that are recommended by the doctor, and it does come back to what you said, Kristen, that shared decision making and what are her goals. And when I finally got to the point of her articulating what she really wanted out of her management of COPD, it changed everything, because it was not aligned with what we wanted. What we were wanting was her to get up and go on vacation and do this and do that. What she wanted was to be able to watch her great-grandchild for half a day or 2 hours without becoming completely exhausted. So I was like, okay, great, then let's work towards that. But it is a very challenging disease. The other thing, I appreciate the smoking cessation, but I think that sometimes, and I heard him say it at the beginning, and it also sort of made me cringe, this is not solely a smoking disease. 1 in 3 COPD patients never smoked. My mother never smoked. And so that stigma associated with COPD still is something that I think we as a patient advocate community have to continue to address. And unfortunately, the guidelines don't do a very good job of holistically addressing a lot of those factors, in my opinion. That's my opinion. And they could use some stronger patient voices on that committee, I must say. But yeah, other thoughts, questions? Yeah, Gundula?
Thank you. Yeah, I was hoping that we would get rid of the GAAPP, with the FEV1, the symptoms, exacerbations, and he didn't show it, but it's really difficult for patients to follow that scheme. It's really difficult. It's hard to explain them what they have to take in account to know where they have to look, which medication they get. So, and I was kind of wondering if I was hospitalized once in my life as a COPD patient because of COPD, then I am stuck in 3 in C or in D. And sometimes, if even if the gold goes 1 or 2, and if you have take your medication properly, you are stuck on the LAMA or LABA medication, and you can get back. That was kind of surprising for me in this moment.
They have as strong of the step down reassessment in COPD as we have in asthma. It's not as defined, right? Yeah.
That I was missing that, and then I was also maybe I missed it, but I was missing the comorbidities. We are talking about interdisciplinary medicine and guidelines, and we really have to address osteoporosis, diabetes, cataract, and also heart diseases, and so on. And we are really working on that this needs to be on that checklist, because the checklist is fine, but that needs to be on the checklist. And about telehealth, it's difficult, but in COVID times, people did it, but patients are very unlucky or unhappy about that, because they say, if the doctor doesn't see me and if he doesn't measure my lung function, he doesn't know how I feel, and I cannot do it at home. So it's in Austria. Maybe they have those little ones.
This is a very important point, actually, Gundula, because spirometry is evolving. It used to, and this is to your point about 2 years without spirometry in the office, and the retraining on spirometry. In the last 5 years, at-home spirometry has made leaps and bounds. I mean, the devices are inexpensive. They are ATS, ERS compliant. It's just we don't have programs to get them in the hands of the right patients, but they're there, and the technology has advanced, as Otto said.
Yeah, that's good. Is it easy to use? Is it easy to use? Talking about devices,
Yeah, they really are. We are using them with a program that we have where we've had 1,000 low literacy, low socioeconomic patients using at-home spirometers, and we've had high, positive impact with them without really any pushback as far as difficulty of use.
Thank you.
Just one comment regarding those spirometry kako se kaže, sredstvo? Device, yes. I'm sorry.
It's always hard to translate, to go back and forth in your head, yes.
Oh, well, I must say that maybe it's different in Europe than in US, because I also didn't, it doesn't mean that I'm the smartest or the most informed person, but I didn't hear about those devices. So maybe it's the same like in Austria. People actually don't know that something like that exists here, here, and maybe it's the one of the problems, or something that we should maybe do a better job on researching. So.
Yeah, I mean, they're actually, as far as cost, you can get a really high quality at-home spirometry device for around $100 US, which is in office like one time measurement. So I think that, again, we just have to help to spread the awareness of those things. Yes.
Yeah, just wanted to comment the same situation, but what happens with understanding of the test, you have to have interpretation, and it's not only spirometry. We have problems, this is personal from our country, with pheno. So we also...
So fractional exhaled nitric oxide for maybe individuals who don't know what...
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Also with diagnosis. So what is when we talk about pediatric patients, what is the limit for diagnosis of asthma for this specific? So what are the guidelines? Different kind of things. So we have situation where our patients are treated with bronchodilatants. instead of topical corticosteroids, and whatever you have problem, just, inhale 2-3 times. So one of the topics I completely agree with you are other diseases that are very connected. So now in this sense, we can talk about, for instance, Ventolin, heart diseases and asthma. It is multidisciplinary, and definitely those devices can help, but definitely we should educate ourselves.
It has to be in the context of the whole person.
Exactly.
And I think that, that, again, our healthcare systems globally are broken today in really addressing that holistic whole person rather than just a single condition or a patient mindset. I often say, I said it yesterday at the International Respiratory Coalition, we are people, not patients. We don't want to be seen as patients. We don't want to be defined by our diagnosis or our disease. And so I think that it's that really all. And the interesting thing I think about the scientific updates today, all of these diseases are connected, right?
Exactly.
We know that there is connection of lung health, immunology, dermatology, even though we're talking about, different organ systems, there is that underlying inflammation in all of these conditions. So as the science evolves, we are understanding that connection and that overlap much more effectively. And we need to address people in that way rather than a single condition.
And sorry, one more thing. We should also understand this connection between corticosteroids and cigarettes. I just on that trace when doctor mentioned about are they functioning if we are inhaling the smoke. We don't have to smoke. So this is also the issue that we have, for example, in countries where it's not forbidden to smoke. And you are a patient with corticosteroids every day, and then is it device or is it exposure to different so many yeah.
I think Kristen was next, and then we'll go to Gundula. Yeah. And we've got just about 4 minutes before we need to break.
I know this is a good discussion. I think too, and this goes back to Tonya's point about sort of adherence to medications. We should approach it that people do not understand them. I mean, I work in this field, and I can remember when I had my first albuterol inhaler, and I opened it up, and I thought, what am I going to do with this? It was, it was a treasure map. I could. So, just as a resource, the COPD Foundation has on our website demonstration videos for all of at least the ones that are available in the States, inhalers and nebulizers. But I think you can sort of hear, and again, I don't want to disparage him, but the tone of, that there's something that the patient is doing, right? And I think if we all need to start approaching it as we're coming to this, help us to get this right?
Yeah. I do think that it is. And also realizing that non-adherence is the norm. Right. Like whoever takes medicine every day exactly like they're prescribed, I would say that they're the exception to the rule, not the rule, right? They're probably OCD, honestly. So, I mean, I think that we have to change our mindset about adherence and realize that non-compliance or non-adherence actually is the norm. It's the patient who does everything to a T that really is the exception. Yeah.
Yes, and that's true what you said about your mom. We have to find the intrinsic motivation for people or for patients, whatever, however, it's another discussion. But you have to find the intrinsic motivation for a person, why he should take the medicine or why he should go to the doctor or why he should do this. As long as we tell them, do it 2 or 3 times a day, it doesn't happen. But if we figure out what is their motivation, their personal motivation, it might become easier. And I was wondering, because you said we don't want to be addressed as patients, because a person with COPD is a patient. And I think if we say it's a person with COPD, or if it's a patient for COPD, the disease vanishes again, and we have to make aware that somebody is sick. And I just wanted, I was
I think that that's an individual choice. I just know that in my conversations with most people, they really don't view themselves as a patient. Even though we use that term, they don't necessarily view themselves as a patient. Is when you're in the doctor's office, when you're in the hospital, when you're in that acute moment. On a daily basis, living with chronic disease, you're a person. And oh yeah, by the way, I also have, right? I think that it may be semantics, like picking apart the words. I'm not trying to do that. I just think that that's at least the feedback that I've heard is like really that desire to be viewed as a person who happens to also live with the condition.
And that's part of that. Sorry, with wording, just wording may be worth to share. In our organization, we keep telling you can choose to live with disease or to live disease. Yeah. So that's the point. We are persons that have diseases, but still work, children, different kind of mom, exactly.
And all of these things,
yes.
All these other roles plus.
Yeah.
Tina?
Hi, I'm Tina from Slovenia, from Atopica. I completely agree. I just want to say that there is maybe one danger with saying most of the patients, as you said, that they want to be like person with something. But for example, from my experience, it's like because of that, sometimes the disease can be like, oh, you're okay. Why are you complaining? You have nothing. I mean, it's just small, unimportant.
We downplay, we normalize, adapt,
and
sort
this,
of don't get the care we need.
And that's the problem, because some of these diseases are severe and really debilitating. Yes. And that's, as you said, it is important that it's like a choice, or just that the debate stays inside of this.
It is that balance. It's all about finding that right balance of how to advocate and get the care you need, and yet not let it define your life or control your life. Well, again, for those that have been online for the scientific meeting, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to break. We've got about till the top of the hour, so 3 p.m. local time here in Prague, before we begin our annual general meeting. And if we will invite all GAAPP members to rejoin us at that time, then we'll get underway at 15, out at the top of 15 here, 3 p.m. Anything else? Okay, great job, everyone. Thank you.